The last gunshot echoed through the Hillsville courthouse, and then a silence fell, a silence heavier and more terrible than any sound before it. Through the thick grey smoke of black powder, the afternoon light struggled to reveal a scene of absolute carnage. The judge, the sheriff, the prosecutor, the very pillars of the law lay bleeding onto the floorboards. The assassins, the notorious Allen clan, had already vanished back into the mists of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This wasn't just murder. It was a declaration of war against the 20th century itself. What could possess men to commit such a brazen act in broad daylight? What unwritten code could be so powerful that it demanded a bloodbath in a hall of justice? To find the answer, we must look past the men who fired the guns, to the woman who forged their iron will in the heart of the mountains. Today, we uncover the story of Barbara Allen, the matriarch of a clan that answered to no law but her own. Hillsville, Virginia, in the spring of 1912, was a town caught between two worlds. Down its muddy main street, you could see the slow, inexorable march of the 20th century in the form of new storefronts and the occasional motor car. But looking up at the surrounding Blue Ridge, you could feel the pull of the old world, a world of isolated hollows, deep-rooted clans, and unwritten laws that had governed these mountains for generations. The brick courthouse stood as the very symbol of this struggle, a place where the new rule of law was meant to replace the old code of blood and honor. At the heart of this new order was Judge Thornton Massey. He wasn't a local man, not born of the same mountain soil as the families he presided over. He was an outsider, an educated man of principle who believed that justice should be blind. To him, a man's last name shouldn't matter, whether it was Allen or Smith. The law was the law, a universal standard that was meant to tame the wildness of the frontier and bring civilization to the hills. He was a stern but fair-minded man, tasked with the impossible job of imposing a foreign authority on a people who had never recognized any authority but their own kin. Sheriff Lewis Webb, on the other hand, was a man of the county. He had to walk a delicate line every single day. He wore a badge representing the government in the state capital, but he lived and worked among neighbors who settled their disputes with fists or a hunting rifle. He knew the Allens. He understood their pride, their temper, and their profound contempt for his office. Every time he served a warrant in a remote holler, he was stepping into a world where his badge meant less than nothing. He was the local embodiment of a law that many saw as an occupying force. Alongside them stood William Foster, the Commonwealth's attorney. He was the voice of the system, the man who used words and legal precedent to fight battles that were more often settled with threats and intimidation. He believed in due process, in evidence, in the power of a logical argument to uncover the truth. In that Hillsville courtroom, he was preparing to argue a case against Floyd Allen, not realizing he was bringing a book of rules to a gunfight. These men were not just public officials. They were pioneers of a new way of life. They were husbands, fathers, and respected members of a community trying to build a future based on order and reason. But a shadow was gathering over them, a tension that was palpable in the cold March air. The upcoming trial of Floyd Allen wasn't just another case on the docket. It was a test of will. It was a direct challenge to the Allen clan's belief that they were a law unto themselves. The world these men were trying to build was one where disagreements were settled by juries, not ambushes. A world where a judge's gavel was more powerful than a patriarch's command. They woke up on the morning of March the 14th, believing in that world, in the safety of their courthouse, and in the strength of the laws they had sworn to uphold. They had no idea that by day's end, their world would be left in ruins, and their bodies would be the final, bloody evidence of a war that had been brewing for centuries. The Hillsville courthouse was no longer a place of law. It was a slaughterhouse. As the acrid fog of gunpowder began to settle, it revealed a scene of pure pandemonium. Men and women who moments before had been calm spectators scrambled for the exits, their screams echoing in the suddenly cavernous room. Those who remained were frozen in shock, staring at the carnage with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The air, thick with the smell of sulfur and fear, hummed with a terrible ringing silence where the rule of law had just been executed. The first people to rush in found Judge Massey slumped behind his bench, the symbol of his authority, now his deathbed. His gavel lay on the floor beside him, a useless piece of wood in a world where steel and lead had spoken the final word. Near the main door, Sheriff Lewis Webb lay fallen, a testament to his final futile attempt to restore order. Across the room, Commonwealth's attorney William Foster was also down, his legal arguments silenced forever. It was a systematic dismantling of the county's legal system carried out in less than 2 minutes. The evidence of the ambush was everywhere. The floor was littered with spent shell casings, glinting like deadly seeds sown on the hardwood. Bullet holes peppered the walls, the witness stand, and the judge's bench, silent witnesses to the storm of violence. Investigators would later count dozens of impacts, a clear sign of multiple shooters firing with reckless abandon. The Allens' chairs were empty. They had simply stood up, unleashed hell, and melted back into the mountains that had raised them, leaving only chaos and death in their wake. The scene offered no mystery as to who was responsible. Every terrified whisper from the survivors confirmed it: the Allens. But the how and the why were a far darker puzzle. How could a family bring a private army into a courtroom? Was this a spontaneous explosion of mountain temper or a cold, calculated assassination? The contradictory accounts from traumatized witnesses only deepened the confusion. The crime scene itself was a brutal message, written in blood and gunpowder. In these mountains, some lines of kinship were thicker than any law, and the price for crossing them was absolute. If you were to search for the man at the eye of this hurricane, all fingers would have pointed to one person, Floyd Allen. He wasn't just a participant, he was the cause. Floyd was the patriarch, a man carved from the hard granite of the Blue Ridge who had amassed wealth, land, and a fearsome reputation. In his corner of Carroll County, his word was law, and his will was absolute. He moved through the world with the unshakable confidence of a king in his own kingdom, a place where the official law was an irritation, a suggestion from a distant world that he was free to ignore. His motive was as clear and cold as a mountain spring. It was pride, a fierce, unyielding pride that defined the very soul of the Appalachian clan system. The initial charge against him, interfering with an officer, was an insult. But the verdict, a year of hard time in the state penitentiary, was an intolerable humiliation. For a man like Floyd, a year in a prison uniform was not a punishment. It was an execution of his honor. It was the state declaring that he, Floyd Allen, was no better than any other man, that his power and his name meant nothing within the walls of their courthouse. The evidence was immediate and overwhelming. The shooting began the very second after Judge Massey pronounced the sentence. Witnesses recounted Floyd standing up, his face a mask of cold fury, and uttering the words that became the spark in the powder room, "I ain't a-goin'." That phrase, spoken with the full weight of his authority, was not a plea or a protest. It was a command. It was the signal to his kin that the time for talking was over. The community didn't need a detective to solve this mystery. They had all seen the simmering rage in Floyd Allen's eyes. He wasn't just a suspect. He was the epicenter of the earthquake that had just leveled the rule of law in Carroll County. But in the shadow of the patriarch stood a figure arguably more dangerous, Claude Allen, Floyd's son and heir apparent to this kingdom of defiance. Where Floyd's rage was born from a lifetime of power and a sudden public challenge to it, Claude's was something different. It was the pure, distilled poison of the Allen creed, passed down from one generation to the next. He was a true believer, a young man who had been taught from the cradle that the only response to an outside threat was overwhelming violence. The twist here is not one of greed or jealousy, but of ideology. Claude's motive was not simply to protect his father, it was to prove himself the worthy inheritor of the Allen legacy. For him, his father's conviction was a stain on his own honor. A year in prison for Floyd meant a lifetime of shame for Claude. He couldn't allow the world to see the Allens as a clan that could be tamed, caged, and broken by Flatlander laws. He was there not just to prevent a sentence, but to make a statement that would echo through the mountains for 100 years. When we re-examine the chaos of that day, one terrible detail rises to the surface. Most historical accounts and eyewitness testimonies agree. Claude Allen fired the first shot. He didn't wait for his father's signal. He didn't hesitate. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Claude drew his pistol and shot Judge Massey point blank. This was not the act of a man caught up in the heat of the moment. It was the act of an executioner. He didn't just join the fight, he started the war. In that single irrevocable moment, he betrayed any possibility of a non-violent outcome and sealed the fate of everyone in that room, turning a family's defiance into a public massacre. But to truly understand the firestorm at Hillsville, you have to look beyond the men and their motives to the larger war being waged. The true external threat wasn't a single person, but an entire century. The 20th century was coming for the Blue Ridge Mountains, not with a friendly handshake, but with the cold, calculating ambition of industry and centralized government. Railroads were cutting through ancient hills, timber barons were eyeing the vast virgin forests, and land speculators were using complex laws to divest mountain families of the very ground their ancestors had settled. This encroaching world saw the old ways of the mountains, the clan loyalty, the self-reliance, the deep suspicion of outsiders as a barrier to progress and profit. And the local instrument of this new world was the courthouse. Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, and Prosecutor Foster were not just men doing their jobs, they were the local agents of this powerful external force. They represented a system that valued deeds and statutes over blood loyalty and tradition, a system that sought to replace the unwritten code of the mountains with the codified law of the state capital. From the Allens' perspective, this wasn't justice, it was a hostile takeover. Every new law, every tax, every court summons was another tightening of a noose around their way of life and their sovereignty. Floyd Allen's trial was the flashpoint. For the state, it was a necessary act to prove that no man was above the law. But for the Allens, it was the final, arrogant push of an invading army trying to break the back of the strongest clan in the county. The massacre, seen through this lens, becomes something more than a family's rage. It was a brutal, desperate act of rebellion against a future they did not want and a system they refused to recognize. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the state of Virginia responded with a fury it had never before unleashed. Governor William Hodges Mann called it a blot on the name of the Commonwealth and vowed that the Allens would be hunted down like animals. He dispatched the state militia and, more importantly, hired the infamous Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private army of detectives known for their brutal and effective methods in breaking Union strikes. A massive manhunt, one of the largest in Virginia's history, was underway. But the lawmen and detectives quickly discovered they were not fighting men. They were fighting a legend, and their enemy was the land itself. The Blue Ridge Mountains, so beautiful from a distance, became a labyrinthine fortress for the fugitives. Every hollow, every creek bed, every rhododendron thicket was a potential hiding place. The Allens knew the secret trails, the hidden caves, the sympathizers' cabins where a door would always be open. The detectives, with their city boots and their organized grid searches, were like children lost in an ancient, hostile forest. The pursuit became a frustrating and humiliating chase after phantoms. A tip would come in that the Allens had been spotted crossing into North Carolina, and a posse would ride for days, only to find the trail was cold, the rumor baseless. Another report would place them in a remote mining camp, but by the time the law arrived, the camp was deserted, with only the faint warmth of a recent fire as proof that anyone had been there at all. The Allens were a mist, dissolving whenever the law drew near, leaving the authorities grasping at nothing but fog and rumors. Back in Hillsville, the investigation into the crime itself was just as tangled. While everyone knew the Allens were guilty, The chaos of the shootout had created a dozen conflicting narratives. Who fired the first shot? Eyewitnesses, still reeling from the trauma, gave contradictory accounts. Some swore it was Claude Allen, others pointed to his cousin, Sidney Allen. The sheer number of guns fired made ballistic evidence a nightmare to sort through. For a brief moment, the state even pursued the theory that this was a wider conspiracy, a planned uprising against the government. But these trails led nowhere, circling back to the same frustrating truth. The Allens had acted as one, a single entity moved by a singular, violent purpose. The law was looking for a single mastermind, failing to understand they were fighting the spirit of an entire clan. The Baldwin Felts detectives soon learned a chilling lesson. The mountains were a fortress of rock and shadow, but the people who lived in them were a fortress of silence. As the manhunt dragged on, the lawmen came down from the cold, empty hillsides and tried to gather intelligence in the small communities and isolated farmhouses. What they encountered was a wall, as solid and impenetrable as a cliff face. Doors that had been opened to strangers were now bolted shut. Faces that were once friendly turned to stone. When asked about the Allens, the answer was always the same. Saw nothing, heard nothing, know nothing. This wasn't just a lack of cooperation, it was a deeply ingrained code of omerta, the unwritten law of the mountains. The first pillar of this code was fear, and it was a fear well earned. The Allens had ruled their corner of the county for decades through a mixture of influence and raw intimidation. To speak against them was to invite ruin. A farmer whose land bordered the Allens might find his best cow missing one morning, or his fence cut in the dead of night. A whisper to the sheriff could mean finding your barn burned to the ground a week later, with no one to blame but the shadows. The community knew the Allens' justice was swifter and more certain than any verdict from a distant court. But it was more than just fear. It was kinship. In the tangled genealogy of the Appalachian hollows, the Allen family tree had roots in every direction. They were connected by blood and marriage to half the families in the county. Asking someone to turn on the Allens was often asking them to betray a cousin, a brother-in-law, or a childhood friend. To these people, the lawmen from the city were the true outsiders, the invaders. The Allens, for all their violence, were their own. Loyalty to blood was a sacred duty that trumped any law written in a book. This wall of silence drove the detectives to the edge of madness. They were in a foreign country, surrounded by people who looked and spoke like them, but who lived by an ancient, invisible set of rules. The truth of the massacre wasn't a secret buried in the ground. It was a story being actively protected behind every locked door and every pair of cold, watchful eyes. The community had closed ranks, forming a silent army that was just as effective as the Allens' own guns at keeping the law at bay. Weeks turned into a month, and the mountains held their secret. The manhunt, for all its resources and manpower, was a spectacular failure. The Allens had been swallowed by the wilderness, and the wall of silence held firm. The detectives were frustrated, the governor was furious, and it began to look as if the Allen clan might have truly committed the perfect crime, disappearing into folklore as ghosts of the Blue Ridge. But the men from the Baldwin Felts Agency were not mountain men. They were masters of human weakness, and they knew that every fortress has a crack. They shifted their strategy. They couldn't out-hike the Allens, so they decided to buy them. Massive reward notices were posted on every courthouse door, every general store window, every fence post from Virginia to Tennessee. The price on the Allens' heads grew to a small fortune, enough money to change a poor dirt farmer's life forever. They were no longer just hunting men with guns, they were hunting them with greed, planting a seed of temptation in the heart of the community. And then, it happened. The turning point came not with a shout, but with a whisper. A secret message, passed through a trusted intermediary, reached the detectives. It wasn't a grand confession, and it didn't come from a core member of the clan. It came from the periphery, from someone whose loyalty was weaker than their desire for the reward money, or perhaps someone who was simply tired of the chaos the Allens had brought down upon them all. The message contained the one thing the law had been missing: a specific location. A small farmhouse, a known sympathizer's home, where Floyd and Claude Allen were believed to be hiding. This was the forgotten clue they had been searching for. It wasn't an overlooked piece of evidence on the courthouse floor. It was a piece of human intelligence, pried loose from the wall of silence by the relentless pressure and the lure of cash. Suddenly, the vast, intimidating wilderness shrank to a single point on a map. The hunt was no longer a blind chase through an endless forest. It was a focused, surgical strike. The momentum had shifted. The Allens' greatest shield, the loyalty of their people, had finally been breached, and the lawmen now knew exactly where to find their prey. Under the cover of a moonless night, the law closed its iron fist around the farmhouse. The Baldwin Felts detectives, moving with the cold professionalism of seasoned hunters, took their positions, their rifles and shotguns aimed at every door and window. There would be no escape this time. The tip from their secret informant had been good. Inside that small wooden building were the two most wanted men in Virginia, Floyd and Claude Allen, the patriarch and the instigator. The air was thick with a silence that felt heavier than any sound, the calm before a final bloody storm. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the mountain ridges, the call for surrender was issued. It was met not with words, but with the bright orange flash of a rifle from a darkened window, the sharp crack echoing across the valley. The farmhouse erupted in a blaze of gunfire. The Allens were not surrendering. They were making their last stand, turning a simple farmhouse into a fort and choosing to die in a blaze of glory rather than be taken alive. For hours, the siege raged, a furious exchange of lead that tore the small building to splinters. But the fight was hopeless. Surrounded and outgunned, the end came swiftly. In a final desperate rush, the detectives stormed the house. And then the legends were made of flesh and blood. Floyd Allen, the powerful patriarch, was found wounded. His fight bled out of him. The aura of invincibility shattered. He was no longer the king of Carroll County, but a captured, bleeding old man. His son Claude, the young firebrand who had started the massacre with a single shot, was also taken, his youthful fury finally extinguished by the overwhelming force of the law. As they were led out of the ruined farmhouse in chains, the full, horrifying truth of their motive was finally unmasked. It wasn't written in a hidden diary or a forgotten letter. It was written in the blood they had spilled and the defiance they had shown to the very end. This was never just about a minor charge or a one-year sentence. This was a battle for a way of life. They were soldiers in a war against a future that had no place for them, fighting for a code of honor that demanded violence against shame. The true culprit, the force that had driven them, was the unwritten law of the mountains, the creed that had been hammered into them since birth. The men who walked out of that farmhouse were the living, breathing products of Barbara Allen's terrible gospel, and Allen does not go to jail. In their capture, they had failed their code, but their final, desperate stand proved just how deeply they believed it. The chase was over, and the men behind the myth were finally exposed. Now, with the benefit of history, we can finally step back into that courtroom and witness the terrible harvest of the Allen creed. Picture the scene. The room is packed, the air thick with tension. Judge Thornton Massey, a man of the law, looks down from his bench. Below him stands Floyd Allen, a man of the mountains, surrounded by his kin. It is a standoff between two worlds, and the wooden walls of the courthouse have become the frontier. The judge's voice cuts through the silence, clear and firm, as he delivers the sentence, 1 year in the state penitentiary. The words hang in the air for a heartbeat, an intolerable insult. Floyd Allen draws himself up to his full height, his face like carved stone. He looks not at the judge, but at his own clan, and makes his declaration, a phrase that will become his epitaph. "I ain't a-goin'." Before the last syllable has faded, the room explodes. The first shot cracks like a whip, a sound so sharp and final it seems to suck all the air from the room. Judge Massey jerks backward, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, and then slumps forward over his bench. His gavel, the symbol of his authority, slides from his hand and clatters onto the floor below. That single sound breaks the spell, and hell is unleashed. The courtroom becomes a roaring, blinding vortex of chaos. Muzzle flashes from the Allen's pistols create strobing, hellish images in the suddenly dark, smoke-filled room. The noise is deafening, a continuous thunder that rattles the windows and shakes the floorboards. Men and women scream and dive for cover, crawling under heavy wooden benches as bullets splinter the wood just above their heads. Papers from the prosecutor's table are thrown into the air by the concussions, fluttering down through the haze like pale, terrified birds. Sheriff Webb, reacting on pure instinct, draws his revolver. He takes but a single step towards the Allens before he is thrown backward, falling near the doorway he was sworn to protect. Across the room, Commonwealth's Attorney Foster rises from his chair, his mouth open as if to object, but his argument is silenced forever as he too collapses to the floor. It is not a gunfight, it is an execution. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stops. An unnatural ringing silence descends, broken only by the choked sobs of the survivors. The thick, acrid smoke of black powder hangs in the air, a suffocating fog that obscures everything. As it slowly begins to clear, the full horror is revealed. The chairs where the Allens had been sitting are empty, and on the walls, on the judge's bench, on the witness stand, are dozens of dark, round marks, the 57 silent witnesses to 90 seconds of absolute carnage. The Allen clan was gone, leaving behind only blood, smoke, and the shattered ruins of the law. The trial of Floyd and Claude Allen was not a legal proceeding, it was a public reckoning. The state of Virginia, its authority profoundly wounded, put the full weight of its power on display. The small town of Wytheville, where the trial was moved to ensure a less biased jury, became the center of a national media circus. Reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago descended, eager to capture every detail of what they called the Savage Mountain Feud. For the state, this was a show trial in the truest sense, a chance to prove, once and for all, that the law of the Commonwealth was stronger than any clan's code of honor. In the defendant's box, Floyd and Claude Allen were not broken men begging for mercy. They were defiant to the last. Floyd sat with the stoic, quiet dignity of a fallen king, his gaze steady, his contempt for the proceedings clear in every line of his weathered face. He listened to the testimony against him not as a criminal, but as a captured enemy general forced to endure the rituals of his conquerors. Beside him, his son Claude was a caged wolf, his eyes burning with an unrepentant fire. They offered no apologies, no explanations. They had lived by their code, and they would die by it. The prosecution's case was simple and brutal. This was a premeditated assassination of the law itself. They painted the Allens as a lawless tribe, a cancerous growth on the body of civilized society that had to be cut out. The defense, in a nearly impossible task, tried to argue that this was a tragedy of culture, a spontaneous eruption of violence born from the unique and volatile honor code of the mountains. They weren't trying to prove innocence. They were trying to explain a worldview that the jury box, filled with merchants and flatland farmers, could never possibly comprehend. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. When the jury foreman stood and pronounced both Floyd and Claude Allen guilty of murder in the first degree, a wave of relief and grim satisfaction washed over the courtroom. But the Allens themselves did not flinch. They had expected no quarter from this foreign court, and they were given none. The sentence followed swiftly: death in the state's electric chair. This final judgment was perhaps the ultimate symbol of the clash of worlds. The Allens had dealt in the hot, personal violence of the pistol. The state would answer with the cold, impersonal, technological power of electricity. In March of 1913, almost a year to the day after the massacre, father and son were executed. For the newspapers and the world outside, justice had been served. But back in the hollows of Carroll County, the story was far from over. The executions didn't end the legend, they cemented it. Floyd and Claude became martyrs, their deaths a final, terrible proof to many that the government's justice was just a more organized form of killing, a verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills to this day. The executions of Floyd and Claude Allen were not an end, but the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. The Allen clan, once a formidable power in the Blue Ridge, was shattered. Their name, once spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, now became a synonym for senseless murder. The clan's other key figures were systematically hunted down and brought to justice. Sidney Allen, Barbara's own son, was wounded in a shootout and captured. He, along with his uncle Sidney Allen, was sentenced to decades in the state penitentiary, a fate that, for men raised on a doctrine of absolute freedom, was a kind of living death. The Allens' land holdings diminished, their political influence evaporated, and their aura of invincibility was gone forever, replaced by a legacy of infamy. At the heart of this ruin sat Barbara Graham Allen, the matriarch who had planted the seeds of this destruction. She lived to see the catastrophic harvest of her teachings. She saw her brother-in-law and nephew sent to the electric chair. She saw her own son, Sidney, locked away in a cage. The central commandment of her life, Allen's "don't go to jail," had become a bitter, ironic prophecy. Her family had either been sent to their graves or to a prison cell, the ultimate humiliation she had raised them to avoid. She died in 1920, a lonely, unyielding woman surrounded by the ghosts of the men she had forged, her final years spent in the quiet desolation of a kingdom turned to ash. The scars on the community of Hillsville ran just as deep. The families of Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, William Foster, and the others were left with an unfillable void. They were not just statistics in a famous crime, they were husbands, fathers, and brothers whose absence left a permanent wound on the town. For decades, the massacre was a shadow that hung over Carroll County, a topic spoken of in hushed tones. The event divided neighbors and created a legacy of bitterness and distrust that would take generations to heal. Hillsville was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It was now a landmark of American violence. The men who escaped the electric chair still paid a heavy price. Sidney and Sidney Allen served long years behind the bleak walls of the Virginia State Penitentiary. Sidney, in a final act of Allen defiance, managed a daring escape but was eventually recaptured. Both were eventually paroled, returning as old, broken men to a world that had moved on without them. They were relics of a bygone era, their lives a long, slow postscript to the 90 seconds of chaos that had defined them. The fire of their youth had been extinguished by the slow, grinding reality of prison life. The tragedy of Hillsville didn't just end with the trials or the prison sentences, it echoed down through the generations. The descendants of the Allen clan had to navigate a world where their last name was a mark of shame. The children of the victims grew up without fathers, their lives forever defined by the violence of that day. The fates of everyone touched by the massacre, perpetrator and victim, lawman and outlaw, remained forever intertwined, bound together by the blood that was spilled on the courthouse floor. The world may have moved on, but in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the past is never truly past. If you travel to Hillsville today, you will not find the brick courthouse where the massacre took place. It was tragically lost to a fire in the 1990s. But for 85 years, that building stood as the most tangible monument to the tragedy. Its exterior walls held the scars of that day, the dark, round pockmarks left by the Allens' guns. For generations, people made a kind of pilgrimage to that courthouse, not just to conduct business, but to run their fingers over those bullet holes, to touch the physical evidence of a day when the law was shot dead in its own home. The echoes of the story are etched in stone in the quiet cemeteries scattered throughout the county. In the Hillsville Cemetery, you can find the graves of Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, and William Foster, their tombstones speaking of duty and a life cut short in service to the law. Miles away, in a family plot, lie the bodies of Floyd and Claude Allen, executed and buried back in the mountain soil that they fought and died for. Their graves, too, draw visitors, those who see them not as murderers, but as symbols of a fierce bygone independence. But the story's most enduring life is in the telling. The Hillsville Massacre seeped into the very soil of Appalachia and grew into folklore. For 100 years, it has been a cautionary tale told on front porches, a ghost story whispered around campfires. Local bards and balladeers captured the tragedy in song, and if you listen closely in the old-time music circles of the Blue Ridge, you might still hear the mournful tune of the Ballad of Floyd Allen, a song that turns the bloody tale into a timeless legend of pride and rebellion. More than anything, the mountains themselves remember. They were the silent witnesses to the Allens' flight, to the manhunt, and to the final, desperate siege. The wind that whispers through the pines on a cold night seems to carry the echoes of the gunshots. The old roads that twist through the hollows still feel as though they carry the memory of the posse's hoofbeats. History in these hills isn't just written in books or carved on monuments. It's a living presence in the landscape, a story the mountains will never let go of. So we return to the question that hung in the gunpowder smoke of that Hillsville courtroom. What could possess men to commit such an act? The easy answer is pride, or anger, or a primitive sense of justice. But the truth is that the most dangerous force in that room was not a man with a gun, but an idea. The idea that a family's honor was worth more than the law, worth more than another man's life, worth more than their own. This was the gospel according to Barbara Allen, a creed so powerful that it turned sons and nephews into soldiers in a war only they believed they were fighting. This is a story not just of a crime, but of a collision between two worlds. The Hillsville Massacre was the sound of an old world breaking against the shores of a new one. It is a brutal lesson in how a code of honor, once necessary for survival in a lawless frontier, can become a death sentence when the world changes. The Allens' fierce loyalty and unyielding pride were the very virtues that had made their ancestors strong. But in the 20th century, those same virtues led directly to the electric chair and the prison cell. Their story is a chilling reminder that the deadliest prisons are not always made of stone and steel, but are sometimes built from the unshakable beliefs passed down from one generation to the next. In the end, this is the tragedy of Barbara Allen. She was the unindicted architect of the massacre, a matriarch whose fierce love for her family's pride was so absolute that it demanded its utter ruin. She was not in the courtroom that day, but her spirit pulled every trigger. She won her battle. Floyd Allen never wore prison stripes, but in doing so, she lost everything. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up. They said bullets curved around him in the air. They whispered that he could melt into the mountain fog like a ghost, that he'd made a deal with the devil himself in some dark and lonely hollow. For years, the name Jacko Fraser was enough to make a child stop crying and a grown man bolt his door at night. The law called him a murderer. But the people who lived and died in these hills had another name for him: the White Devil. But how does a man become a monster? How does flesh and blood turn into a legend that haunts a landscape for 100 years? Today, we hunt for the truth behind the ghost story. To understand a man like Jacko Fraser, you first have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the Cumberland Mountains in the late 1800s on the jagged border of Virginia and Kentucky. This was a land forgotten by God and the government, a place of stunning beauty and breathtaking cruelty. The mists that clung to the hollows hid deep secrets, and the ancient hills had seen more than their share of blood and tears. The Civil War had ripped through these communities, leaving behind not just poverty, but a generation of men who had been taught that the fastest way to solve a problem was with a rifle. They came home to find their farms in ruins and their futures uncertain. The law, in this part of the world, was a distant rumor. A county sheriff might hold authority in the dusty courthouse square, but out in the winding creeks and isolated cabins, his power faded to nothing. Here, a different law held sway, the law of the clan. Family was everything. Your name was your flag. Your cousins were your army. An insult to one was an insult to all, and debts of honor were paid in blood. This was the era of the great feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, where violence was not just an outburst of anger, but a structured part of life, a grim inheritance passed down from father to son. This fierce loyalty was born of isolation. The dense forests and impassable ridges didn't just separate families from the outside world, they separated them from each other. Every farmstead was its own small kingdom, every cabin a fortress. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and a man representing the government was seen as the biggest stranger of all. People here learned to rely on themselves, their kin, and their own judgment. But self-reliance couldn't always put food on the table. This was a world of grinding poverty. Families survived on what they could scratch from the rocky soil, what they could hunt in the deep woods, and what they could distill in a hidden still under the light of the moon. For a man with a quick trigger finger and no conscience, the desperation hanging in the air smelled like opportunity. It was into this boiling cauldron of pride, poverty, and clan justice that Jacko Fraser was born. The world he saw was not a place of laws and morals, but a battlefield for survival. The mountains were poised on a knife's edge, holding a fragile, violent peace. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by an invading army, but by a monster it had created in its own image. Long before the massacre that made him a legend, Jacko Fraser's name was already a poison whispered on the mountain wind. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His terror was fed by a network of lesser evils and silent supporters. Men like Henley Cox, his most notorious accomplice, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, lesser predators orbiting a greater one. And there were others, the small-time crooks who bought his stolen goods, the informants who'd trade a neighbor's whereabouts for a silver dollar or just to settle an old score. The Mullins clan, on the other hand, were the opposite of everything Jacko stood for. They were a large, well-respected family, a cornerstone of the community, which made them the perfect target for a man who wanted to prove that no one and nothing was safe. The deepest wounds in these mountains were often the oldest. Jacko himself was said to be a veteran of the Confederacy, a man who had seen the world burn and decided he liked the heat. He didn't come back from the war looking for peace. He came back carrying the war inside him, a personal battle against a world he felt had failed him. His grudge wasn't over a single plot of land or a stolen horse. His grudge was with humanity itself. He saw society as a sham, and he aimed to tear its mask off with violence. Of course, smaller, more personal grudges festered in every hollow. A card game that ended in a bitter accusation, a dispute over a property line that had been argued for generations, a family that got a little too prosperous for a neighbor's liking. These were the hidden fault lines running beneath the community. Jacko was a master at exploiting them. He understood the dark currents of envy and resentment that flowed beneath the surface of daily life, and he knew how to use them to his advantage, turning the quiet suspicions between neighbors into open fear. And so, the rumors began to spread, moving from cabin to cabin like a sickness in the air. At first, they were just unsettling stories. A peddler who was supposed to be heading through Pound Gap simply vanished. A farmer found his best mule gone, his tack shed emptied. A lone traveler would arrive at the next settlement pale and shaken, telling a story of being robbed on the trail by a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. None of these were big enough to bring the law down from the state capital, but they were carefully stacked. one on top of the other, building a foundation of dread. Every story, filtered through a dozen mouths around a dozen hearths, grew darker and more menacing. The whispers turned into a constant, low hum of anxiety that settled over the mountains. People began to look at the shadows a little longer. The sound of a horse at night was no longer a comfort, but a cause for alarm. The community was being slowly poisoned, not just by Jacko's deeds, but by the fear of what he might do next. The stage was being set for an act of violence so brutal it would turn whispered rumors into terrified screams. The year was 1892. For the Mullins clan, it was a day of prosperity. Several members of the family, including Ira Mullins, his wife, and other kinsmen, had made the long journey by wagon to the nearest town. They were returning home, their carts laden with goods, and more importantly, their pockets heavy with cash from a successful day of trading. We're talking several $100s, a staggering fortune in those mountains, enough money to set a family up for a year, or to make a desperate man do the unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A narrow mountain path, barely wide enough for their wagons, snaking its way through the dense, dark woods of Pound Gap. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fail, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the edges of the trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horses were the only sounds in a world that was growing unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The woods were holding their breath. It was a feeling every mountain person knows in their bones. The difference between a peaceful silence and a waiting one. Perhaps one of the men glanced nervously into the darkening trees. Perhaps a child in the wagon pulled a blanket a little tighter around their shoulders, sensing a shift in the air. They were on their own land, just miles from the safety of their homes. But that feeling of safety was beginning to fray like an old rope. They were being watched. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the forest, a command rang out, a harsh voice slicing through the quiet, telling them to halt. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Before the echo had even died, the trees erupted in a blaze of rifle fire. The led horse screamed and reared, falling in its traces. The quiet evening was shattered by the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, and the first cries of shock and pain. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. The point of no return had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of violence that would stain these mountains forever. The ambush was brutally efficient. The narrow pass became a slaughter pen, a claustrophobic trap from which there was no escape. The first volley of shots sent a wave of chaos through the wagon train. It was a cacophony of terror, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the rock walls, the splintering of wagon boards, the high-pitched screaming of wounded horses, and the raw human cries of disbelief and agony. Men who had been solid, living figures just a second before now crumpled to the ground, becoming nothing more than dark shapes in the failing light. But the attackers were not wild animals in a frenzy. They moved with a chilling purpose, emerging from the tree line like specters. Among them, one figure moved with a terrifying calm, his pale eyes scanning the wreckage with an unnerving detachment. This was not a fight. It was a harvest. As the survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist, Jacko Fraser and his men moved in, their rifles barking with methodical precision, each shot finding its mark. Ira Mullins lay wounded in the dirt, the life seeping out of him onto the very land his family had worked for generations. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Jacko Fraser standing there, his face as impassive as carved stone. There was no rage in his eyes, no flicker of emotion at all. It was the cold, empty gaze of a man looking at an object, not a human being. A revolver appeared in Jacko's hand. The metallic click of its hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Then came a single sharp report that slammed the door shut on Ira Mullins's life. With the killing done, a new and even more grotesque phase began. Jacko knelt beside the body of the man he had just executed, and with the calm demeanor of a clerk counting change, reached into his pockets and retrieved the thick roll of money. This cold ritual was repeated as the gang moved from one still form to another, their hands searching pockets and pouches. They were not just murderers, they were grave robbers, desecrating their victims before the bodies had even grown cold. When the last echo of gunfire had faded and the last coin had been pocketed, what remained was a tableau from hell. A wagon lay on its side, its contents, flour, cloth, tools, spilled across the dirt road like the entrails of a dying beast. The horses lay tangled in their harnesses, their great bodies still and silent. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavy and motionless. It was the silence that was the worst part, a profound, deafening silence where just moments before there had been life, laughter, and hope. And as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Jacko and his men didn't flee in a panic. They simply stepped back into the deep woods, swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed them. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up, unleashed its demons, and then closed again, leaving behind no evidence of their passage, only the wreckage of a family and a silence that screamed. This was more than a robbery. It was more than murder. It was a statement written in blood on a lonely mountain trail. It was a declaration that there were no safe places, that the bonds of family and community were no shield against a man with a frozen heart. On that day, in the twilight of Pound Gap, John Fraser the outlaw died, and Jacko, the White Devil, was well and truly born. The silence that followed the massacre was deeper than any grave. For a time, the only witnesses were the ancient trees and the cold, unblinking stars. It was a kinsman sent out from the Mullins homestead when the wagons failed to return who stumbled into the nightmare. He found the scene not by sound, but by its terrible stillness. The dark, hulking shape of the overturned wagon, the pale glimmer of spilled flour on the ground looking like a dusting of snow, and then the bodies, scattered among the wreckage like fallen leaves, their stillness an affront to nature itself. The cry that broke from that man's throat was a sound of pure horror, an animal howl of grief that finally shattered the unholy calm. When the news reached the Mullins family, it was like a physical blow, a shock that left them gasping for air. But in the Appalachian heart, grief is a fast-burning fire that quickly turns to iron resolve. The women's wails of sorrow echoed through the hollows, a heartbreaking chorus for the dead. But the men's faces were a different kind of terrible. Their grief was silent, their eyes hard and cold, their hands resting on the stocks of the rifles that were never far from reach. They tenderly carried their dead home, but in their hearts, they were already carrying a vow of vengeance. News in the mountains travels not on wires, but on the wind, passed from cabin to cabin in hushed, urgent whispers. The story of the Pound Gap massacre spread like a plague of fear. It confirmed every dark suspicion, every campfire ghost story. The name Jacko Fraser was no longer just a name. It was a curse, the living embodiment of every settler's deepest fear, the fear of what lurked in the untamed wilderness just beyond the light of their lanterns. Doors were bolted earlier. Men took their rifles with them to plow the fields. The comfortable darkness of the mountains, once a familiar blanket, now felt like a shroud, filled with unseen, malevolent eyes. The sheer brutality of the attack was too much to be ignored, even by the distant and often indifferent hand of the law. The murders weren't just a crime, they were an insurrection against the very idea of society. The authorities in both Virginia and Kentucky, pressured by the influential families and a terrified populace, were finally prodded awake. A substantial reward was offered for the capture of Jacko Fraser and his gang, a fortune that could make a poor man rich for life. The notice was nailed to the courthouse doors and the sides of general stores, turning the ghost into a wanted man with a price on his head. The bodies of the Mullins family were laid to rest in the cold mountain earth, but their story refused to be buried. The massacre became a line drawn in the dirt. On one side was the world of families, faith, and hard work. On the other was Jacko Fraser. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the White Devil, a figure of folklore born from a real-world atrocity. The hunt was now not just a matter of law, but a crusade. The question was, how do you hunt a man who is already a ghost? The bounty posters were barely dry before the hunt began. This was not going to be a simple posse of local farmers. The states of Virginia and Kentucky marshaled their forces, calling in the best they had. They hired professional detectives from the famed Baldwin Felts agency, outsiders with city methods and a reputation for ruthlessness. But the man chosen to lead the hunt was a legend in his own right, Marshal Big Ed Hall. He was a man cast from the same mountain rock as Jacko, who knew every secret trail and hidden hollow. He was Jacko's opposite, a man of the mountains who had chosen the badge over the outlaw's gun. And alongside the lawmen and hired guns rode men with faces like stone. They were the kin of the murdered Mullins family. They weren't there for the reward money. They were there to settle a family score, and their justice wasn't written in any law book. Hunting Jacko Fraser in the Cumberland Mountains was like trying to catch a whisper in the wind. He was in his element, a predator on his home ground. The very landscape that the posse found so punishing was his greatest ally. The mountains that had cradled him now conspired to hide him. For weeks, they combed the ridges and ravines, a grueling ordeal of cold nights and false trails. The posse would find the embers of a campfire still warm, or a footprint in the mud of a creek bed, only to have the trail vanish into thin air. It was as if Jacko could simply dissolve into the mist. The mountains that had once been a home to the posse members had now become a deadly labyrinth, and in its center lurked a monster who knew every turn. The posse grew weary, their resolve frayed by frustration and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. They knew Jacko was out there, seeing them long before they saw him. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an ambush, every shadowy rock formation a sniper's nest. But in the end, it wasn't a tracker's skill or a detective's logic that cornered the White Devil. It was human weakness. A name was whispered to the lawmen. An informant, tempted by the life-changing reward or simply terrified into submission, gave up Jacko's hiding place. The mountain's code of silence had finally been broken by the one thing stronger than loyalty: fear. The tip-off led them to a lonely, isolated cabin near the Kentucky border. They surrounded it in the dead of night, a ring of steel closing in under a moonless sky. As the first grey light of dawn touched the peaks, Big Ed Hall gave the signal. The quiet morning was torn apart by a final desperate volley of gunfire as Jacko tried to fight his way out. But it was hopeless. He was one man against a small army. When they dragged him out into the light, blinking and bloodied, the posse members steeled themselves, expecting to see a demon. Instead, they saw a man. His clothes were ragged, his body weary from weeks on the run, but his eyes were the same. In their icy depths, there was no fear, no regret, not even anger. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, and the bottomless exhaustion of a man who knows his road has come to an end. For the lawmen, it was the end of a manhunt. But for the Mullins kin who stood there, watching the man who had destroyed their world, the look in their eyes said that true justice had not yet begun. The arrest of the White Devil was a sensation. His trial in Wise, Virginia, was a pilgrimage. People came from 3 states, on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, clogging the dusty streets of the small county seat. They weren't there to see justice done. They were there to see the monster in a cage. The courthouse stood under the watchful eye of armed guards, its lawn transformed into a sprawling camp of onlookers. The air buzzed with a carnival-like energy, a strange mix of grim satisfaction and morbid curiosity. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a public exorcism. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick enough to choke on. Every bench was crammed, with men standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The judge, the lawyers with their starched collars, the 12 men in the jury box, they were all part of a system trying to impose its formal logic on a story of primal savagery. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Their voices trembled with a mixture of grief and lingering fear as they recounted the horrors of that evening in Pound Gap. They pointed trembling fingers at the man sitting at the defendant's table, and Jacko Fraser just sat there. He showed no remorse, no fear, not even a flicker of interest. As survivors wept on the stand, he watched them with the same detached curiosity a man might watch a bug crawling across a windowsill. His silence was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He was a void, a black hole of human feeling in the center of the room, and his cold, defiant calm was his final weapon. He refused to play their game, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was a monster, and he seemed content to let them know it. The trial was, as everyone knew it would be, a formality. The evidence was absolute, the testimony unshakable. When the jury filed back in, their faces were grim and set. The foreman didn't need to clear his throat. His voice was steady and clear as he pronounced the single word that everyone had come to hear: guilty. A collective sigh, a wave of relief and whispered approval washed over the courtroom. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty, sentenced John Jacko Fraser to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The law of men had spoken. But as the crowd spilled back out into the sunlight, a question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every person who called these mountains home. Was this justice? A clean, quick, state-sanctioned death on a gallows? Did that truly pay the debt for the ambush in Pound Gap, for the cold-blooded murder of men in front of their families? The law had delivered a verdict, a neat and tidy conclusion. But the justice of the mountains, the old law of blood for blood, demanded something more. It demanded an ending as brutal as the beginning. The court had provided a legal answer, but the people were still waiting for a final moral one. On September 15, 1893, a trapdoor opened in Wise, Virginia, and the physical life of Jacko Fraser came to an end. They say a great sigh of relief swept through the crowd, as if a poison had finally been purged from the air. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a common fate for notorious outlaws, to prevent his final resting place from becoming either a shrine or a site of desecration. The earth simply swallowed its monster, leaving no stone to mark his passage. The man was gone, but his ghost was just beginning to walk. The story of the Mullins family did not end in that dusty pass. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and did what mountain people have always done: they endured. Their family line continued, a testament to a resilience far stronger than Jacko's nihilistic rage. Today, their descendants still live in those hills, carrying the memory of the massacre not as a chilling legend, but as a deep and painful part of their family history. Their names are carved in stone in old family cemeteries, the date of their death a permanent, silent, and defiant answer to the violence that tried to erase them. The world has changed dramatically since that bloody evening. A modern highway, US Route 23, now carves a smooth paved path through Pound Gap. You can drive through the very spot where the ambush happened at 70 miles an hour, listening to the radio, your mind a million miles away. But if you pull over to the side of the road, cut the engine and listen, the modern world falls away. The woods are just as deep, the shadows just as long. In the quiet, you can almost feel the weight of that terrible silence from so long ago. The old courthouse in Wise still stands, a brick-and-mortar witness that has held the story within its walls for over a century. And of course, there is the legend of the treasure. Like all famous outlaws, Jacko was rumored to have stashed his ill-gotten fortune, thousands of dollars in gold and silver coin, somewhere in the labyrinthine caves and crevices of the Cumberland Mountains. For decades after his death, treasure hunters, armed with old maps and older rumors, dug into the hillsides, chasing the ghost's promise of cursed gold. The treasure was never found, of course, but the hunt itself became a part of the story, keeping the White Devil's name alive, a whisper of greed and danger that echoed through the generations. Most people have forgotten the facts of the case. The official records are yellowed and brittle, gathering dust in courthouse archives. But the mountains have a long memory. The name Jacko Fraser still surfaces from time to in these parts, a dark ballad told around a late-night fire. He is no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a piece of the landscape itself, a warning, a folktale, a permanent shadow that time has not been able to erase. So we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How does a man become a monster? The story of Jacko Fraser gives us a chilling answer. He wasn't born a demon. He was forged in the fires of a brutal war and hammered into shape on the anvil of a lawless, desperate land. He was the ultimate consequence of a world where civilization was a distant rumor and survival was a daily battle. The White Devil wasn't a supernatural force. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had shed every last piece of his humanity and embraced the darkness that waits inside us all. And how does a monster become a legend? His cruelty was so absolute, so far beyond the normal feuds and fights of the mountains, that people had to make him more than a man to understand him. It was easier to believe he was a ghost who could melt into the fog, a demon who had made a pact with Satan, than to accept the horrifying truth, that a human being, a man of flesh and blood, could be capable of such cold, empty evil. The legend of Jacko Fraser wasn't just a story told to frighten children. It was a story adults told themselves to make sense of the senseless. This isn't just a tale of true crime. It's a parable etched into the very rock of these mountains. It is a story of the terrible beauty and brutal reality of the Appalachian frontier. It reminds us that for every hero there is a shadow, and that the history of this place is written in both courage and in blood. Jacko Fraser was more than a murderer. He was the living embodiment of the mountain people's deepest, darkest fear, the fear of what lurks in the shadows just beyond your own doorstep. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Imagine the Tennessee frontier in the dead of night. A settler family huddles in their small cabin, listening to every snap of a twig outside. Suddenly, the air explodes with the terrifying gobble of a Cherokee war cry. But amidst the chaos, another sound cuts through the fear, a sound so unnatural it freezes the blood. It's a voice, shouting orders to the painted warriors in perfect, unaccented English. This is a story whispered in terror around the campfires of the first American frontier. A story of a raid led not by a native, but by a man with white skin. How does a settler's son, born to fear and fight the Cherokee, become their most cunning and brutal war chief? What can happen to a man in the depths of the wilderness to turn his soul inside out, making him a monster to his own people and a legend to his sworn enemies? The newspapers called him a traitor, a turncoat. But the men and women who lived in these mountains knew the truth was something far darker, far more complex. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of rumor and time to find the real story of the man they called Nickety Jack. Before the legend of Nickety Jack was ever whispered, there was just a boy, and a world built on the knife's edge of hope and terror. To understand the man he became, you must first walk through the world he lost. This was late 18th century Appalachia, a labyrinth of misty hollows and shadow-choked forests that the settlers called Tennessee. The mountains themselves were the first great character in this story. They were ancient, indifferent, and possessed a beauty that could steal your breath one moment and your life the next. The morning fog clung to the valleys like a shroud, and the creeks whispered secrets that only the Cherokee, who had lived there for generations, could understand. The people who came to this land were a hard breed, mostly Scots-Irish, who had traded the tyranny of landlords in the old country for the freedom of this new, wild world. They were clannish, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of any authority beyond their own family and a long rifle. For them, the land was a promise from God, a thing to be wrestled from the wilderness tree by tree, rock by rock. Life was a cycle of back-breaking labor, clearing fields, splitting rails for fences, and building stout log cabins with loopholes cut into the walls, just in case. In one of these cabins lived a boy well called Jack. He was a product of this harsh Eden. Before he had a man's beard, he could track a deer for miles, skin it with a hunter's knife, and handle an axe with grim efficiency. He knew the relief of a heavy bar locking the cabin door at night, and the deep, gnawing fear that came with every owl's hoot or snapped twig from the dark woods that pressed in on all sides. His world was simple, carved in the stark black and white of the frontier. His people were the settlers, the families who gathered to raise a neighbor's barn or share a prayer on Sunday. The enemy was the Cherokee, a shadowy, terrifying presence in the forest. This was a life lived under a constant, low-burning siege. Peace was a fragile thing, an illusion that could be shattered in an instant. Every man who went to the fields carried his rifle. Every woman knew the quickest way to gather her children and bolt the door. The silence of the forest wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting for the single gunshot or the blood-chilling war whoop that would signal the end of everything. Yet, there were moments of grace. The scrape of a fiddle by the hearth on a cold winter night, the shared laughter over a successful harvest, the simple dream of a future where their children wouldn't have to live with a gun in their hands. They dreamed of turning this dangerous wilderness into a home, a legacy. They saw themselves not as invaders, but as pioneers, fulfilling a destiny written for them in the pages of the Bible. They were building a new world on this land they had claimed. But the land itself seemed to remember. The Cherokee called this place the Dark and Bloody Ground, and that name clung to the air like the mountain mist. The treaties signed by men in powdered wigs hundreds of miles away meant little here. There was a debt on this land, a tension in the very soil, and every settler, in the quietest corners of their heart, knew that a day of reckoning was coming. The calm they cherished was nothing more than the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. This wasn't empty land that Jack's family and others had settled. To them, it was a wilderness to be tamed, a future to be built. But to the Cherokee, every river bend, every mountain pass, every clearing had a name, a story, and a spirit. Their claim wasn't written on a piece of parchment from a distant king. It was etched into the land itself, in the bones of their ancestors, buried in the sacred mounds that dotted the river valleys. The conflict that would swallow Jack whole wasn't born from a single act of violence. Its seeds were sown generations before in two completely different ways of seeing the world. The great fire that forged these lasting hatreds was the American Revolution. While men in the East fought for liberty from a king, the war in these mountains was a brutal, intimate affair. Most of the Cherokee, seeing the insatiable hunger of the American settlers, had sided with the British. It wasn't out of love for the crown, but from a cold, hard calculation. The British, for their own reasons, had tried to draw a line along the crest of the Appalachians, forbidding colonial expansion. To the Cherokee, the redcoats were the devil they knew. The land-hungry settlers were a plague that could never be stopped. When America won its independence, it was a death warrant for the Cherokee way of life. The line on the map was erased. The veterans of the Revolution, having bled for this new nation, felt they had earned this land as a spoil of war. They came flooding over the mountains, armed with land grants given in lieu of pay, a sense of righteous purpose, and a deep-seated hatred for the people who had sided with their former enemy. Every raid was seen as a continuation of that war. Every act of resistance by the Cherokee was seen as treachery. In these mountains, a family name was a heavy thing to carry, a story in itself. For the settlers, a name like Sevier or Shelby was a banner of leadership, of Indian fighting, of a divine mandate to push civilization westward. A boy like Jack grew up knowing these names, knowing that his own family name carried with it a duty to stand your ground, to protect your kin, and to never, ever yield to the wilderness or its people. But the Cherokee had names that carried an even older weight. Their great war chief, Tsiyugunsini, or Dragging Canoe, had a name that was a living promise. It was a vow of unending resistance, a declaration that the sale of their ancestral land was a crime that would be paid for in blood. To be a follower of Dragging Canoe meant you never forgot a broken treaty. It meant you fought until the last warrior fell. This was the world Jack was born into, a place where the lines weren't drawn in the dirt, but in the blood of a war that had never truly ended. In a world this isolated, news traveled on the wind, and it was almost always bad. The ground for the conflict that would claim Jack's identity was made fertile by a web of rumors and old, festering grudges that poisoned the very water in the creeks. The settlers were not one unified people. There were the hardliners, men who had lost family in previous raids, whose hearts were calcified with a hatred so pure they believed the only good Indian was a dead one. They were the first to grab a rifle and the last to ask questions. Then there were others, quieter families, who just wanted to farm their land in peace, who might even trade a bit of corn for a well-cured deer hide with a Cherokee hunter they knew. To the hardliners, this was treason. These small, personal interactions were a constant source of friction, but it was the bigger events that fanned the flames. Just a season before, after a few horses were stolen from a homestead, the local militia had formed up. Blind with rage, they bypassed the warrior towns of the Chickamauga and fell upon a small, peaceful Cherokee village known for trading with the whites. They burned the lodges and killed whoever they could catch, arguing later that any Cherokee was a potential enemy. To the settlers in their forts, it was a necessary act of frontier justice, but to the Cherokee, it was an unforgivable massacre of innocents. The story of that raid spread like a wildfire through the Cherokee nation. Runners carried the news from town to town, the story growing more horrific with each telling. It was the proof they needed that the white man's peace was a lie, that his true goal was not just to take the land, but to exterminate their people entirely. This one act of undisciplined vengeance became a rallying cry. It drove neutral bands into the arms of Dragging Canoe. It turned young men who had never held a weapon into warriors screaming for revenge. Back in the settlements, the air grew thick with paranoia. The fear of retaliation was a physical presence, sitting at the dinner table with every family. Neighbors started looking at each other with suspicion. Who among them was trading with the enemy, giving them food, or worse, gunpowder? Who was the weak link in the chain of defense? Rumors slithered from one cabin to the next like black snakes in the high grass, turning small misunderstandings into deadly accusations. This wasn't a conflict of armies meeting on a field. It was a war of the soul, fought in the whispers between neighbors and the stories told to children. Every past slight, a dispute over a hunting ground, a trade deal gone sour, a drunken insult at a horse race, was dug up from its shallow grave. These old wounds were now infected with the fresh poison of fear and hatred, and the community was rotting from the inside out. The stage was set not just for a war between settlers and Cherokee, but for a war within the hearts of the people themselves. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the very air in the hollows grew heavy, as if the land itself knew what was coming. The old people, those with one foot still in the superstitions of the Scottish Highlands, saw the signs and spoke of them in hushed tones. They said the cry of the painter, the Appalachian mountain lion, had been heard too close to the settlements, its scream sounding unnervingly like a woman in mourning. Flocks of crows would gather in the skeletal branches of a lightning-struck oak, sitting in unnatural silence, watching the cabins below with their black, intelligent eyes. It was a bad luck moon, they whispered, a time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of spirits was thin and torn. Then came the human omen, not a single stranger, but the news he carried. A trapper, passing through on his way back east, brought a rumor that spread faster than fire. He spoke of new talks, of another treaty being planned by the far-off government, one that would demand the Cherokee give up all the hunting grounds between the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. To the settlers, this news was a poisoned promise, a green light to push deeper, to stake claims on land that wasn't yet theirs. But to the Cherokee, and especially to the warriors of the Chickamauga, this rumor was the final insult. It was proof that every treaty was a lie, every promise a trap. The time for talk was over. The time for war was now. And a young Jack, who knew the forest as well as he knew the lines on his own hand, felt it too. He couldn't put a name to it, but there was a change in the woods. The familiar sounds of the wilderness were off-key, strained. The deer were gone from their usual trails, and an eerie quiet had fallen over the paths he used to walk. One afternoon, while checking a trap line near the creek, he was overcome by a sudden, gut-wrenching feeling of being watched. He spun around, long rifle ready, but saw nothing but the deep, impenetrable wall of the forest. The feeling didn't pass. It was a cold dread that settled deep in his bones, a premonition that the shadows under the trees were no longer empty. Something was coming. The world he had always known was holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. The breaking point came not with a negotiation or a declaration, but in the grey, misty hour just before dawn. The silence of the forest didn't break. It shattered. It started with a single, sharp report of a rifle, followed an instant later by the sound that every settler dreaded more than death itself, the terrifying, gobbling war cry of the Chickamauga. It erupted from all sides at once, a wave of pure, predatory sound that washed over Jack's small, isolated settlement. The attack was not a battle. It was a storm, a whirlwind of violence that descended with shocking speed and precision. For Jack, the world dissolved into a blur of smoke, muzzle flashes, and painted faces that seemed to materialize from the fog. He was on his feet in an instant, long rifle in hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The splintering crash of the cabin door being forced inward was followed by the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning pine as torches were thrown onto the roof. There was no time for strategy, no time for anything but the primal instinct to fight for his life and the lives of his family. He fired his rifle, reloaded in a desperate, fumbling motion, and fired again into the chaos. He was young, strong, and knew how to fight, but he was one man against a tide. He saw his world coming apart in flashes of horrific violence. He swung his rifle like a club, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but he was overwhelmed. A blow from a war club sent him reeling, his vision exploding in a shower of stars. He was subdued, his arms wrenched behind his back and bound tightly with leather thongs. He was not killed. For reasons he couldn't comprehend in that moment, he was being kept alive. Forced to his knees in the dirt outside his burning home, Jack watched the end of his world. The raid was over as quickly as it had begun. The warriors, their work done, melted back into the forest, taking their captives and their spoils with them. The only sounds left were the crackle of the flames devouring his cabin and the terrible, unnatural silence that follows a slaughter. As he was hauled to his feet and dragged away into the dark woods, he took one last look back. He was leaving behind not just a smoking ruin, but the body of the boy he used to be. The line had been crossed. The first drops of blood had been spilled, and they were his own family's. The feud was no longer a distant rumor. It was now the only thing he had left. For Jack, helpless on the ground, the world became a series of horrific sounds and fractured images, a nightmare seen through a haze of smoke and terror. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Seconds felt like hours. He heard his father's voice, not in a plea for mercy, but in a defiant roar of rage, a sound of pure, untamed frontier spirit. And then he heard that roar cut short, replaced by a wet, choking gasp that was swallowed by the surrounding chaos. The sound was so final, so absolute, it felt like the whole world had tilted on its axis. He couldn't see everything. The swirling smoke and the flickering firelight played tricks on the eyes, creating monstrous shadows that danced and writhed, but he could hear. He heard a scream from the cabin, a high, sharp sound of a woman's terror that was suddenly silenced. It wasn't followed by another scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a war club against the cabin's thick wooden door, a sound of methodical, relentless destruction. Every impact was a blow against his own heart. Through a momentary clearing in the smoke, his eyes fixed on a single, heartbreaking image. His little sister's corn-husk doll, the one she took everywhere, lay on the ground, trampled into the mud. Its simple, stitched smile seemed to mock the carnage, a tiny, innocent casualty in a war it could never understand. Nearby, his mother's rocking chair lay on its side, one of its rockers split clean in two. These were the small, mundane pieces of his life, now shattered and desecrated, silent witnesses to the end of his world. The warriors moved with a terrifying efficiency. This was not a mindless rampage. It was a practiced military operation. They flowed through the settlement like a dark river, their movements economical and purposeful. One warrior emerged from the cabin not with a weapon, but with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. Another calmly collected the long rifles that had been mounted over the fireplaces. They were not just destroying, they were erasing a life and taking its resources for their own. Then, a figure of authority emerged from the smoke. He was taller than the others, his face a mask of grim purpose, not rage. He walked over to Jack and looked down at him, not with hatred, but with a cold, appraising stare. His eyes were like dark chips of flint. He looked at the bound, terrified boy. Then his gaze shifted to the burning cabin, then back to Jack. No words were spoken, but the meaning was as clear as a rifle shot. This is what your people have earned. This is the price of the land you stole. As the warriors began to pull him away, dragging him toward the dark tree line, the main roof beam of his home finally gave way. With a great groan, it collapsed into the heart of the inferno, sending a massive plume of orange sparks spiraling up into the pre-dawn sky. It was a funeral pyre for his family, for his name, for the boy he once was. The sound of the flames was the last sound he heard from his old life. And then there was a new sound, the unnatural quiet of the forest, broken only by the soft tread of moccasins on the damp earth. As they marched him deeper into the wilderness, away from the glowing embers of his past, he felt nothing. The shock had scoured him clean, leaving a hollow, echoing void. All he could see, burned into the back of his mind, was the image of that small, mud-stained doll, its vacant eyes staring into an empty sky. To the settlers, the war chief who led this raid was a monster, a devil from the deepest hell. But in his own mind, he was a surgeon performing a painful, necessary operation. Standing on the ridge overlooking the settlement, watching the orange glow of the fires, he felt no sadistic pleasure. He felt the cold, heavy weight of a man trying to save his people from a plague. His logic was as sharp and brutal as the edge of his tomahawk. For every broken treaty, there must be a price. For every acre of stolen land, there must be a reckoning. For the massacre of his people in the peaceful village just a season ago, there must be a response so terrible it would be spoken of in whispers for generations. This wasn't about hatred for the white man as a person. He had seen their courage and their stubbornness. He hated what they were collectively. A tide of locusts that consumed the forest, drove away the game, and plowed over the sacred bones of his ancestors. They did not understand the land. They only understood how to own it. To him, every new cabin was a tombstone for the Cherokee way of life. He was not the aggressor. He was the antibody. the fever that must burn the infection before it killed the host. His violence was a form of medicine, bitter and agonizing, but in his mind, it was the only cure. The moment that changed everything for Jack was a moment of cold calculation for the chief. He had seen the boy fighting. While others screamed or fled, this one fought back with a cornered wolf's fury. He saw past the pale skin and the settler's clothes and recognized a spirit that was worth more alive than dead. Killing another settler would send a message for a day. But turning one? That was a weapon that could last for years. In his mind, the switch flipped from destruction to opportunity. He saw the boy not as a victim, but as a piece of raw material, a lump of iron to be heated in the fires of their ways, hammered into the shape of a warrior, and quenched in the cold waters of their revenge. As he and his warriors melted back into the forest with their captive, there was no feeling of triumph. There was only a grim, chilling sense of balance restored. He had answered their violence with his own. He had shown them that the dark and bloody ground would live up to its name. The raid was a success, but the war was far from over. He looked at the bound, silent boy being marched through the trees and felt not a shred of pity, but a flicker of strategic hope. He had lost warriors. His people were hungry. But in this one act of calculated cruelty, he believed he may have just forged the one weapon the settlers would never see coming, a ghost with their own face. As the sun finally rose, its clean morning light fell upon a scene from hell. The raid was over. The warriors were gone. In their place, they left a profound, unnatural silence. The birds did not sing in the trees surrounding the clearing. The usual sounds of a frontier morning, the crow of a rooster, the lowing of a milk cow, the ring of an axe, were gone, replaced by the soft, hissing whisper of the smoldering cabin. A thick, greasy smoke, smelling of burnt pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet, hung heavy in the humid air, clinging to the valley floor. The cabin itself was no longer a home. It was a blackened skeleton, its chimney rising into the sky like a tombstone. The first to find it was a neighbor from the next ridge over, a man named Miller, who had come looking to borrow some shot. He approached cautiously, his long rifle held at the ready. He'd heard the faint echo of gunfire before dawn, but had prayed it was just a hunter. As he entered the clearing, he stopped dead. The scene before him was so absolute in its devastation that his mind couldn't immediately process it. He took in the trampled garden, the slaughtered livestock, and the gaping, fiery maw of the cabin. His breath caught in his throat. He saw the bodies then, scattered where they fell, and the hard, grim mask of the frontier fell over his face. He became a machine, his eyes scanning for any sign of life, for survivors, for tracks. The alarm was raised by hoofbeats and a hoarse voice screaming a single word: "Raid!" The news spread like a contagion of fear from one isolated homestead to the next. Barricades were dropped into place on cabin doors. Women gathered their children, their faces pale and drawn, while men took their rifles down from the mantles, their knuckles white as they checked the flint and powder. The fragile peace of the frontier had been a comforting lie, and now the brutal truth had returned. Every shadow was a warrior, every rustle of leaves a threat. The entire community was now a fortress under siege, locked in the grip of a cold, collective terror. Back at the smoking ruins, a small party of men gathered. They moved with a grim purpose, their faces set like stone. They were there to bury their dead, a task performed with a terrible, silent reverence. But as they accounted for the fallen, a chilling realization dawned on them. Jack, the family's eldest son, was not among the dead. His body was nowhere to be found. The immediate assumption was that he had been taken captive, dragged away for a fate many considered far worse than a quick death. A tiny, desperate flicker of hope was born, the hope of a rescue, but it was quickly choked by the dark possibilities of what captivity meant. This was not a crime to be solved by sheriffs and judges. This was an act of war, and it demanded a warrior's response. The local militia captain, a veteran of countless brutal skirmishes, declared an immediate pursuit. A posse of grim-faced men was formed on the spot. Neighbors, relatives, and seasoned Indian fighters whose eyes burned with a cold, patient fire. There was no talk of justice, only of vengeance. A bounty was offered, not for the return of a captive, but for Cherokee scalps. It was a hard, jagged promise of revenge, a vow to repay blood with blood. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the posse rode out, their horses kicking up dust and ash, and disappeared into the same vast, silent wilderness that had swallowed the boy called Jack. In the wake of the slaughter, the community didn't come together. It clenched like a fist, tight and trembling. The open-hearted frontier spirit vanished overnight, replaced by a lockdown of suspicion and fear. Families that once shared meals and helped raise barns now looked at each other from behind barred doors and through the narrow slits of rifle loopholes. The local blockhouse, once a place for social gatherings, became a grim refuge where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and the bitter taste of fresh grief. It was here, in the cramped, suffocating confines of the fort, that the first cracks began to show. The lines were drawn in the dirt floor. On one side stood the militia captain and the families who had lost kin, their faces masks of cold rage. Their argument was simple and brutal. Every man who could hold a rifle needed to join the posse and ride until they had burned the Chickamauga towns to the ground. To them, any hesitation was cowardice. Any argument for caution was a betrayal of the dead. Their grief had burned away all nuance, leaving only the white-hot desire for vengeance. On the other side were the quieter folks, the families whose cabins were furthest out on the fringe of the settlement. They didn't speak up in the public meetings, but their silence was a heavy, stubborn presence. They knew a terrible truth. If every able-bodied man rode out on a quest for revenge, their own homes would be left defenseless, ripe for the picking. They were caught in an impossible choice: join the posse and risk their own families, or stay behind and be branded cowards and traitors by their neighbors. The war was no longer just outside the walls. It was inside, dividing them man from man. This division was fed by a conspiracy of silence, born not of guilt, but of pure, rational terror. Many of the settlers knew the woods. They knew there were Cherokee who wanted peace, and there were the implacable warriors of the Chickamauga who wanted war. Some may have even seen the direction the war party fled. But to speak that knowledge aloud was to paint a target on your own door. The warriors of Dragging Canoe had eyes and ears everywhere. To be seen as an informant for the militia was a death sentence, one that would be carried out in the dead of night, swift and silent. So people who knew things said nothing. They became deaf and blind, their fear a gag in their mouths. In this atmosphere of paranoia, small acts of character were magnified. A woman whose own pantry was nearly bare secretly left a small sack of cornmeal on the doorstep of a widowed neighbor. A quiet act of courage that risked angering those who believed every family should fend for itself. But there were acts of cowardice too. A man who was questioned by the posse gave them a deliberately vague direction, sending them on a wild goose chase into the swampy lowlands, simply because he wanted the trouble as far away from his own land as possible. The community was breaking under the strain, revealing the true nature of its people, not in their loud proclamations of unity, but in the quiet, desperate choices they made when they thought no one was watching. The posse that rode out from the settlement was not a disciplined army. It was an instrument of pure, hot-blooded vengeance. At its head rode the militia captain, a man whose face was a roadmap of past sorrows and old hatreds. Beside him was a grizzled tracker named Elias, a man so thin he looked like he was made of sinew and wood smoke, a man who could read a broken twig the way a preacher read scripture. Behind them came the farmers and blacksmiths, their jaws set, their eyes scanning the tree line. They were not lawmen seeking justice, they were hunters, and their prey was human. For the first day, they made good time, following the clear, brutal trail of the war party through the lowlands. But as they climbed into the tangled green maze of the mountains, the world changed. The forest deepened, the air grew cooler, and the sun became a distant, mottled light through the thick canopy of leaves. They were entering the Cherokees' domain now, and the wilderness itself seemed to rise up to protect its own. The trail became a phantom, a whisper of a moccasin print here, a displaced stone there, signs only Elias could see. The pursuit slowed from a gallop to a grim, plodding walk. Days bled into a week. The hunt became an ordeal, a war not just against the Cherokee, but against the mountains themselves. They clawed their way through rhododendron thickets so dense they called them hells, their clothes and skin torn to ribbons. A sudden, violent thunderstorm turned the ravines into raging torrents, nearly sweeping away their horses. Rations dwindled, and the men's burning rage cooled into a sullen, gnawing exhaustion. The mountain was wearing them down, sanding away their resolve, and Elias grew quieter, his eyes darting nervously. He knew this feeling. They weren't just following a trail, they were being led. The trap was sprung at a place called Cutter's Gap, a narrow pass flanked by high, rocky cliffs. Elias found the sign they were meant to find, a single discarded feather from a warrior's headdress lying in the open. It was a taunt, a dare. As the posse filed into the gap, a sudden, chilling war cry echoed from the rocks above, and the air was instantly filled with a deadly swarm of arrows and rifle balls. Chaos erupted. One man fell from his saddle with a cry, an arrow buried in his chest. Another screamed as a ball shattered his arm. The posse was caught in a perfect crossfire, unable to charge and with no cover to speak of. They fired their rifles wildly at the cliffs, but they were shooting at ghosts. They could see nothing but puffs of smoke from behind the rocks. The militia captain, his face a mask of fury and desperation, saw the truth in an instant. This wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. "Back!" he roared. "Fall back!" The retreat was a panicked, desperate scramble. They dragged their wounded with them, firing blindly over their shoulders as they fled the gap. As quickly as it began, the attack stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the only sound the ragged gasps of the retreating men and the moans of the injured. The posse limped back into the settlement days later, a beaten and broken thing. They returned with empty saddles and hollow eyes. They had not found the war party. They had not recovered the captive boy. All they had found was the chilling, undeniable proof that out here, in the heart of the shadows, they were not the hunters. They were the prey. The hunt was over. Jack was gone for good, swallowed by a wilderness that would not give him back. And so, my friends, there was no grand trial in a courthouse. There was no judge in a black robe, no jury of 12 good men and true. The Cherokee warriors who burned the settlement and stole the boy were ghosts. You cannot put a shadow in the dock, but a trial did happen nonetheless. It took place in the dusty, crowded courtyard of the blockhouse, under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, and the verdict handed down would poison the community for years to come. The defendants were the returning members of the posse, hollow-eyed men who walked with the stoop of the defeated. The jury was the rest of the settlement, the women, the old men, the children, who stared at them with a mixture of pity and accusation. There were no lawyers, but there was a prosecutor. He was a raw-boned farmer whose younger brother had been one of the men left behind in Cutter's Gap. He stood before the militia captain, his face contorted with grief and rage, and spoke in a voice that trembled but did not break. He accused the captain of incompetence, of pride, of leading good men into a slaughterhouse just to satisfy his own hatred. "You didn't hunt them," he spat. "You fed them our kin." The militia captain stood and took it. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't smirk with defiance. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. When the farmer was finished, the captain spoke, his voice low and gravelly. He described the impossibly rugged terrain, the cleverness of the trail, the perfect, deadly precision of the ambush. He spoke not of savages, but of a masterful enemy fighting a brilliant defensive war on their own ground. He admitted his failure, but his words carried a chilling undertone. They had not simply been beaten, they had been profoundly outclassed. He had brought the law of men into the mountains, and the mountains had laughed. There was no gavel to announce the verdict. It was written in the averted eyes and the hard, unforgiving set of the jaws of the other settlers. The farmer who had spoken the accusation turned his back on the captain and walked away. Others followed. The posse, the symbol of their collective strength and law, was broken. The captain was not formally stripped of his rank, but he might as well have been. He was a leader with no one left to follow him. The community had found him guilty, not of malice, but of something worse on the frontier: weakness. He had failed to provide the only kind of justice they understood, the justice of blood for blood. And so the central burning question remained unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke. Was this justice? The system of the settlers, their organized militia, their belief in their own strength, had failed completely. The raiders were free, roaming the mountains, perhaps even watching them from the ridges. The boy was gone. The dead were in the ground. The verdict of the blockhouse trial was clear. The law of men was useless here. The only thing left was the justice of the mountains, a bitter personal code of survival and revenge, where every man was his own law and every stranger was a potential enemy. The verdict of the community trial, delivered in silence and turned backs, settled over the settlement like a permanent winter fog. Life went on, but it was a stunted, withered version of what had come before. The militia captain, the man who had led the failed posse, became a ghost at his own hearth. He still worked his fields, but he moved with the heavy, shuffling gait of a man carrying a corpse on his back. His authority was gone, his name a quiet synonym for failure. The community didn't banish him, but they didn't have to. They simply looked through him, and in doing so, they erased him. This was his curse, to live out his days among his people, but to be utterly alone. But while the settlement was turning inward, licking its wounds and slowly burying the memory of its own failure 100 miles away in the deep green shadows of the mountains, Jack was being unmade. His life after the verdict was not a curse or an atonement, it was a crucible. He was not being punished in the way the settlers imagined. He was being systematically taken apart, piece by piece, and put back together in a new and terrifying shape. The Cherokee chief who had captured him was now his teacher. The boy's old life was burned away, not with cruelty, but with a relentless, immersive education. He was forced to learn the Salagi language until his English tongue grew thick and clumsy in his mouth. He was taught to hunt, not with the loud boom of a rifle, but with the silent flight of an arrow, to move through the forest without snapping a twig, to become another shadow among the trees. This was more than just learning new skills. It was a reprogramming of his very soul. They did not just teach him how to fight, they taught him why they fought. By the light of the council fire, he heard the history of his new people. It wasn't a story of savage raids, but a long, heartbreaking litany of broken promises, of sacred lands stolen, of women and children murdered by the very people he had once called his own. The massacre that had destroyed his family, which had once been a singular, world-ending tragedy, was now presented to him as a single link in a long, unbroken chain of violence initiated by the settlers. He was being given a new truth, a new history, and it was a story that, to his broken and betrayed heart, made a terrible kind of sense. Back in the settlement, the scars were fading by force. The community, in a desperate act of self-preservation, began to forget. The burned-out ruins of Jack's cabin were slowly swallowed by the aggressive green of the wilderness, becoming a taboo place no one visited. The names of the men who died in Cutter's Gap were spoken less and less, and the name of the lost boy, Jack, was buried the deepest of all. It became a lesson whispered to children before bed, not a story of heroism, but a grim warning about the price of weakness, a ghost story to keep them close to home. They were trying to heal by cutting out the memory, but they had left the wound to fester in the dark. Years turn into decades, and decades into centuries. The official histories of Tennessee, written in neat ink in leather-bound books, rarely mention a boy named Jack or a warrior called Nicotee. The records of that time are a chaotic jumble of land deeds, militia muster rolls, and faded letters. A story this personal, this brutal, this shameful simply slips through the cracks. But it didn't vanish. It did what all powerful stories in these mountains do. It went to ground, seeping into the folklore of the region like water into limestone, whispered from one generation to the next. For the descendants of the settlers, the name Nicotee Jack became a boogeyman, a cautionary tale told to frightened children who wandered too far from the cabin. He was the ultimate horror, not the savage from without, but the traitor from within. To this day, there are places on old maps, hollows and ridges, that carry names whose dark origins are long forgotten by most. A place called Cutter's Gap still exists, a name that means nothing to the tourists who drive through it, but to a few old families, it's a place where the air still feels heavy. The story of Nicotee Jack became a part of their DNA, reinforcing a deep-seated distrust of outsiders and the ever-present fear of the wilderness's power to change a man for the worse. But there is another echo, one that is rarely heard. Among the descendants of the Cherokee, particularly those whose ancestors fought with dragging canoe, the story is different. They remember the white Indians, the captives who were adopted and became fierce defenders of their new people. In their version, a man like Jack is not a traitor, but a man whose eyes were open to the truth. His story is not one of shame, but of a spirit that was Cherokee in its heart, regardless of the skin it was born in. It is a haunting and powerful thought that somewhere today, among the members of the Cherokee Nation, there are people who carry the blood of this lost boy, a forgotten link in a chain of survival they may not even know exists. You cannot go and find a monument to Nicotee Jack. There is no tombstone with his name on it, neither his settler name nor his Cherokee one. If you knew where to look, you might find a slight depression in the forest floor, a place where a cabin once stood, now marked only by a few moss-covered foundation stones and a patch of ground where the wild blackberries refused to grow. This is the only physical trace left of the world that was lost. His real monument is the story itself, the chilling echo of his name that has managed to survive the centuries. Because while people forget, and the paper they write on turns to dust, the mountains remember. The ancient, silent ridges that witnessed the raid are still standing. The creek where he was taken captive still carves its path through the valley. They hold the memory of the gun smoke, the blood, and the impossible choice a young boy was forced to make. The mountains saw it all, and in their deep, enduring silence, they keep the truth of the story safe, waiting for those who are quiet enough to listen. So we return to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, like smoke from a dying fire. How does a boy become a monster to his own people? The easy answers are the ones history prefers. He was a traitor, a turncoat, a man whose mind was broken by captivity. But the truth, my friends, is far more unsettling. The wilderness didn't turn Jack into a savage. It simply burned away the boy he was and showed him the man he was always capable of becoming. His old world, built on a foundation of righteous belief, was shattered by a single act of violence. His new world, though brutal, offered him something he had lost: a family, a purpose, and a cause that felt righteous in its own terrible way. He wasn't stolen so much as he was forged anew. This is more than just the story of one man. It's the story of the Appalachian frontier itself. It is a timeless lesson that the line between civilized and savage is a fragile thing, a line drawn not on a map, but in smoke and blood. It reminds us that every story of heroism has a shadow, and every act of monstrous violence has a logic, however twisted it may seem. This is a story not just of cruelty and hatred, but of the indomitable human spirit in its most extreme form, the desperate need to belong to a tribe, and the terrifying lengths a person will go to defend it, especially when he has to choose that tribe himself. The name Nicotty Jack no longer belongs to a boy or a warrior. It has become a piece of the mountain itself, a haunting whisper on the wind that reminds us of the true cost of this land. He is a ghost born of two peoples, belonging to neither, but a timeless reminder that the deepest battle lines are not drawn between forts and villages, but are carved directly through the human heart. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. A volley of rifle fire tore through the quiet air over the Kentucky River, and the man they called Bad Tom Baker fell. The one-armed king of Clay County, a figure whispered about with a mix of terror and awe, disappeared into the murky water. History calls it the end of a feud. But was it just a family squabble over a stolen pig or a stray card game? Or was it the assassination of a tyrant who had turned the law into his personal weapon and ruled an entire county through sheer brutal force? Today, we dig past the headlines to find the truth behind Appalachia's most feared family dynasty. To understand the Bakers, you have to understand the land that shaped them. Clay County, Kentucky, after the Civil War, was a world unto itself. Carved by deep, misty valleys the locals call hollers, it was a place where the modern world's grip was weak. The people here, mostly descendants of tough Scottish-Irish settlers, lived by a code much older than any state constitution. Family wasn't just important, it was everything. Your clan was your nation, your church, and your army, all rolled into one. Life was hard, scraped from thin soil and dense forests. Logging and salt mining were the only real industries, and in a place with so little power wasn't measured in dollars, but in influence. The most coveted prize was the sheriff's badge, because whoever held it didn't just enforce the law, they were the law. They controlled taxes, settled disputes, and decided who prospered and who starved. It was a king's throne in a kingdom of log cabins and dirt roads. This isolated world was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Civil War had split communities down the middle. Neighbor fought neighbor, and those wounds never truly healed. The Bakers had largely sided with the Union, while many of their future rivals, like the Howards, had fought for the Confederacy. They returned from the war not as countrymen, but as vanquished foes and bitter victors, forced to live side by side in these tight, unforgiving hollers. Every day was a fragile truce. Men worked their land with a rifle never far from reach. They gathered at the county seat of Manchester with pistols tucked in their belts, their eyes constantly scanning for the face of an old enemy. They were proud, stubborn people, steeped in a tradition where an insult to one was an insult to all, a debt that could only be paid in blood. They didn't know it yet, but their way of life was standing on the edge of a cliff. The world of quiet mountain self-reliance was about to be shattered by a feud so brutal it would become a legend. A small grudge, born from this soil steeped in hate, was about to grow into a war that would drench the courthouse steps in red and leave a legacy of fear that would echo for 100 years. History loves a clean starting point. A single gunshot, a stolen kiss, one insult that tips the world into chaos. But in the mountains, feuds rarely have a single beginning. They fester. They grow in the dark like mold, feeding on old wounds and whispered grudges. The Baker-Howard feud was no different. Some old-timers swear it started over a card game, when a Baker accused a Howard of cheating, and words gave way to fists, then knives. Others say it was something as simple and as serious as a stolen boar. The truth is, it doesn't matter which spark lit the fuse. The whole county was a powder keg that had been sitting since the Civil War, just waiting for any reason to explode. And the man who struck the match was Thomas Baker, known to history as Bad Tom. He wasn't just another brawler in a long line of them. He was different. There was a cold fire in his eyes, a charisma that drew men to him, and a ruthlessness that made them fear him. He'd lost an arm in a sawmill accident, but this only added to his mythic stature. With one hand, they said, he could handle a rifle better than any two-handed man in the state. He was the living embodiment of his family's pride and their rage, and he didn't just join the simmering conflict, he became its heart. The feud might have remained a series of back-alley brawls and drunken shootouts, if not for one thing: politics. Bad Tom saw that true power wasn't just in the barrel of a gun, but in the sheriff's badge that could legitimize its use. He ran for sheriff, and through a campaign of charm, intimidation, and likely a few backroom deals, he won. This was the point of no return. The law was no longer a neutral force in Clay County. It was now a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Howard clan and their allies. Suddenly, the game had changed. This was no longer just about family honor. It was about survival. For the Howards, facing a sheriff who was also their sworn enemy, there was no court of appeal, no neutral ground. Their only path was to fight back with the same ferocity. The threats, once muttered in saloons, became open declarations of war. A loaded cartridge might be left on a windowsill, a silent promise of what was to come. A rider might gallop past a Howard cabin in the dead of night, firing a single shot into the darkness, not to kill, but to remind them that they were never safe. The time for talking was over. Under the reign of Bad Tom, the streets of Manchester, the county seat, became a theater of war. Court days were the most dangerous. The air would grow thick with tension as the armed clans gathered, their eyes locked on each other across the town square. It wasn't a matter of if violence would erupt, but when. And one day, it did, in a way that would be seared into the county's memory forever. As the Howards and their allies stood on the courthouse steps, the world exploded in a deafening roar of gunfire. From concealed positions, the Bakers unleashed a coordinated volley. For a moment, there was only the thunder of rifles and the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke. Then came the screams. Men who had been standing tall moments before crumpled to the ground. The white columns of the courthouse, symbols of law and order, were stained with something other than rain. When the gunsmoke finally cleared and a ringing silence fell, the ground was littered with the fallen. The law hadn't just been broken, it had been executed in broad daylight. But the horror wasn't confined to these public spectacles. The war followed people home. It crept onto their porches in the dead of night, leaving a single bullet on a windowsill, a silent promise. Or worse, a small, crudely carved coffin, a message more chilling than any spoken threat. A family would be sitting down to supper, and a shot would ring out from the darkness, shattering a window pane. The bullet wasn't meant to hit anyone. It was meant to shatter their peace, to remind them that they were never safe, to exhaust their nerves until they broke. The mountains, once a source of comfort, became an enemy. Every bend in the road, every dense patch of woods, could be hiding an ambush. The Bakers knew these hills like the back of their one remaining hand. They would strike from the trees like ghosts and melt back into the forest, leaving behind only chaos and fear. Travel between hollers became a life-or-death gamble. Perhaps the darkest tale whispered about Bad Tom was the one about his own cousin. The story goes that the man showed a moment of weakness, a flicker of cowardice in the face of the enemy. For Bad Tom, this was a betrayal worse than any other. He summoned the man to the family home, and as the cousin stood on the doorstep, a single shot echoed through the holler. It was a message to everyone, friend and foe alike. In the Baker clan, loyalty was absolute, and the price for breaking the code was paid on the spot, without hesitation. After the smoke cleared from the courthouse steps, a new kind of silence fell over Clay County. It wasn't peace, it was the suffocating quiet of absolute fear. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and the streets of Manchester emptied as if a plague had swept through. The only ones who moved freely were the Bakers and their allies, who walked with the swagger of conquering heroes. The law, which had bled out on the town square, was now whatever Bad Tom Baker said it was. For the survivors of the Howard clan, grief quickly hardened into a cold, unbending resolve. They carried their dead back to their family plots in the quiet hollows, but they weren't just burying their kin. They were burying any hope of conventional justice. To appeal to Sheriff Baker to investigate a crime committed by the Bakers was not just futile, it was a death sentence. They knew then that the war would not be won in a courtroom or on a ballot. It would only end when Bad Tom Baker was in the ground. The fear was a poison that seeped into every corner of life. Neighbors who had known each other for generations stopped speaking, their eyes averting in the street lest a friendly word be misinterpreted as taking a side. Business ground to a halt. The mountains that had once been a sanctuary became a prison, and the legend of Bad Tom grew with every whispered story. People said he couldn't be killed, that he'd made a deal with the devil for his one-armed marksmanship. In the flickering firelight of their cabins, people began to believe that he wasn't a man at all, but a spirit of vengeance sent to punish the county for its sins. But the gunshots in Manchester echoed far beyond the hills of Clay County. Newspapers in Frankfurt and Louisville began to run sensational stories about bloody Clay, painting it as a savage land ruled by a one-armed tyrant. The state government, long content to let the mountain counties manage their own affairs, could no longer ignore the anarchy. The governor was embarrassed. Rewards were quietly offered for information, and the first whispers of sending in the state militia began to circulate. The outside world was finally starting to peer into the heart of darkness that Clay County had become. This external pressure, combined with the desperation of his enemies, sealed Bad Tom's fate. His opponents realized they couldn't outfight him, and they couldn't outvote him. They had only one option left. In secret meetings, deep in the woods, a plan was forged. It wouldn't be a fair fight, because a fair fight with Tom Baker was one you lost. It would be an ambush. They began to watch his movements, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to cut the head off the snake and end his bloody reign for good. With Bad Tom Baker's body lost to the Kentucky River, you might think the story was over, but it wasn't. His death wasn't an act of law, it was an assassination. And now, the law of men finally came to Clay County. The state, embarrassed and angry, sent in troops and prosecutors. The war of ambushes and shootouts was over. The war of witness stands and gavels was about to begin. The courthouse, once a battlefield, was now to be a place of judgment. The trials that followed were a spectacle, a clash of two entirely different worlds. Armed state militiamen stood guard, their faces grim, watching a crowd that was divided by an invisible line of hatred. On one side sat the remaining Bakers, on the other, the Howards and their allies. In the middle were the city lawyers in their pressed suits, trying to apply abstract legal principles to a conflict fueled by generations of raw, personal vengeance. For the mountain folk packed into the gallery, it was a strange and foreign circus, where truth seemed less important than procedure. The men in the dock were a study in defiance. Whether Baker or Howard, they showed little remorse. They sat with a stoic dignity, their faces carved from the same hard Appalachian rock as their homes. To them, this wasn't a trial for murder. It was a trial of survival. They looked at the judge and the jury, not with the eyes of guilty men, but with the weary gaze of soldiers who had fought a long and brutal war, only to be judged by outsiders who had never spent a single night in the trenches. They didn't plead for mercy, because mercy wasn't a currency they understood. The verdicts, when they came, were as messy and complicated as the feud itself. Some men were convicted, sent away to rot in a Frankfurt prison, becoming martyrs to their families. Others, even those known to have pulled a trigger, were acquitted. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember faces. Juries of local men who had to live in these hollows long after the judge went home delivered verdicts that defied the evidence. The law came to Clay County, but it found that the old codes of silence and clan loyalty were stronger than any prosecutor's argument. In the end, the state declared the feud officially over. The newspapers reported that justice had been served. But was it? For the people who lived it, the court's justice felt hollow. It didn't bring back the dead. For every man sent to prison, another known killer walked free. The trials didn't bring closure. They just forced the hatred underground, where it would simmer for another generation. The law of men had imposed a fragile peace, but the justice of the mountains, a justice of blood for blood, was left unfinished, an angry ghost that would haunt the hollows for years to come. The trials ended, the troops went home, and a quiet, exhausted peace settled over Clay County. The Baker dynasty, once a force that could command a private army and bend the law to its will, crumbled. Without the iron fist of Bad Tom to hold it together, the clans scattered like ashes in the wind. Some of his sons and lieutenants went to prison. Others moved away, changing their names to escape the shadow of their family's bloody reputation. The name that once inspired terror now became a quiet mark of a past best left buried. But the past is never truly buried in these mountains. It just sleeps. If you go to Manchester today, you'll see a modern town. The courthouse that once ran with blood has likely been renovated, its columns scrubbed clean. But if you look closely, the real story is still there. It's in the small, forgotten family cemeteries hidden up in the hollows, where weathered headstones bear the names of young men who didn't die of old age. The dates tell a silent story of a war that history books barely mention. The land itself seems to hold the memory. And if you find an old man sitting on his porch and you ask him about the feuds, you'll see a change in his eyes. The stories are still told, not as history, but as cautionary tales whispered on long winter nights. They'll tell you about Bad Tom, the one-armed king, and how he ruled this county with fear. The official records are sparse, but the oral history, passed down from grandfather to grandson, is rich and terrifying. The name Baker is no longer a threat. It's a legend, a ghost that haunts the local memory. Most of the cars that drive the winding roads of Clay County are just passing through, their drivers unaware of the ghosts that linger in the shade of the trees. But the mountains remember everything. They remember the gun smoke and the screams. The Kentucky River still flows, the same dark water that swallowed the body of Bad Tom Baker, taking his secrets with him. The feud is over, but its echo remains, a permanent part of the landscape, a whisper in the Appalachian wind. So we return to where we began, with the body of Bad Tom Baker sinking into the Kentucky River. Was his story just another bloody chapter in a family feud, born from a stolen pig or a crooked card game? The truth is, it was so much more than that. It was the story of how a man, forged in the fires of isolation and clan warfare, took the ancient mountain code of honor and twisted it into a crown. He wasn't just a feudist, he was a king, and Clay County was his brutal, bloody kingdom. His death wasn't just an act of revenge, it was a regicide, the only way his subjects knew to end a tyrant's reign. The story of the Baker dynasty is a dark mirror held up to the heart of Appalachia. It's a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people, their fierce loyalty, their stubborn pride, and their refusal to bow to any authority but their own. But it's also a terrifying lesson in what happens when that spirit is poisoned by poverty and old hatreds. It shows us how thin the line is between a man protecting his family and a man destroying his community, between justice and vengeance. This isn't just a tale of outlaws and shootouts, it's a story about a forgotten America, a world where the only law that mattered was the law of blood. The men who fought and died in these hills weren't simple villains. They were complex, desperate men, living by the only code they'd ever been taught. Their legacy is a reminder that the past is never as clean or simple as the history books would have us believe. And that is why we must keep these stories alive, pulled from the shadows of the misty hollows. Because they remind us of the fire and the blood that shaped this land, and of the ghosts who still walk here. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. The rope was already around his neck. On May 1st, 1868, Tom Dooley looked out over the crowd and with his last breath spoke the words that would seal a woman's reputation in darkness for eternity. He said, "If it wasn't for Anne Melton, I wouldn't be on this scaffold today." Was it a damning accusation? A confession of his own weakness? Or the last desperate act of a man protecting the woman he truly loved? We all know the song about the hanged man and his dead lover, Laura Foster. But the legend has a third name, a shadow at its heart. Today, we separate the ballad from the bitter truth to answer one question. Was the true monster in this story the one who walked away free? To understand the blood that was spilled, you first have to understand the soil it stained. This was Wilkes County, North Carolina, in the year 1866. The air in these mountains still tasted of gunpowder and defeat. The Civil War had bled the hollows dry, sending its sons home not as conquering heroes, but as ghosts. Men returned to find their farms overgrown, their families gaunt with poverty, and a silence in the valleys that felt heavier than before. Life was a stubborn, grinding affair, measured by the seasons and the sweat of your brow. It was a world of hard work, quiet faith, and passions that, once stirred, ran deeper and faster than any mountain creek. Into this world walked Thomas Dooley, known to everyone as Tom Dooley. Before the war, he was the boy with the quick smile and the fiddle that could make the devil himself tap his feet. But the Tom who came back was different. He'd survived the living hell of Point Lookout prison camp, and the experience had burned something out of him, replacing it with a reckless charm and a darkness in his eyes. He still played the fiddle, but now the tunes seemed wilder, more desperate, as if he was trying to drown out memories that followed him from the battlefield. At the unshakable center of Tom's world was Anne Pauline Melton. She was Laura Foster's cousin, married to a quiet farmer named James Melton, a man who seemed to exist only in her shadow. Anne was not just beautiful, she was a force of nature. With dark, knowing eyes and a will as strong as iron, she was a woman who refused to be contained by the small, pious world she inhabited. Her affair with Tom Dooley was the worst-kept secret in Elkville, a blazing fire that everyone saw, but no one dared try to put out. It was a passion born long before the war, and it had only intensified upon his return. And then there was Laura Foster, younger, fairer, and by all accounts of a gentler nature than her cousin Anne. She was a girl on the cusp of womanhood, with dreams that were likely as simple as they were sincere: to be courted, to be married, to build a life. She, too, fell under the spell of the handsome, haunted fiddle player. In her, Tom perhaps saw a chance at a different kind of life, a peace he could never find with the tempestuous Anne. For a time, this fragile, dangerous balance held. Life went on. James Melton ploughed his fields, pretending not to know. The community whispered behind their hands at church and at the general store. Anne held court, the queen of a tiny, isolated kingdom, with Tom as her devoted, reckless knight. And Laura Foster watched from the edges, her heart full of a hope that was about to turn deadly. They were all caught in a web of love, jealousy, and obligation, unaware that the world they knew was about to be burned to the ground. But the war had sent home more than just broken men. It sent home a sickness, a blood taint that traveled in silence. It was an unseen enemy, carried in the veins of a soldier, that would soon become the catalyst for an act of brutality that would leave these mountains forever scarred. The storm was coming, and no one even saw the clouds gathering. The Fosters, the Meltons, the Dooleys, these were not new names in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their roots ran as deep as the ancient oaks, clinging to the rocky soil for generations. They were descendants of the first Scots, Irish, and English settlers who pushed into these wild, unforgiving hollows in the late 1700s. They came seeking land of their own and a life free from the meddling of kings and governments. They fought the wilderness, They fought the natives, and sometimes they fought each other to hold on to the small plots of earth that defined their existence. This land wasn't just property, it was a testament to survival paid for in sweat and blood. Every creek, every ridge, every dark stand of timber was tied to a story, a birth, a death, a memory. But history had left scars on this land that had never truly healed. The Civil War was the deepest of them all. Wilkes County had been a place torn in two. While many men like Tom Dooley marched off to fight for the Confederacy, the hills were also crawling with Union sympathizers, draft dodgers, and outright deserters. It was a war fought not just on distant battlefields, but in hushed conversations and suspicious glances between neighbors. Loyalty became a currency more valuable than gold, and betrayal was a poison that could linger in a family's well for 50 years. When the war ended, it didn't bring peace. It brought a simmering resentment. The men who came back, like Tom, were changed, and the community they returned to was fractured. The old order was shattered, and the law was often little more than a suggestion. In this power vacuum, the oldest laws of the mountains reasserted themselves, the laws of clan and kin. And in this world, a name was a heavy thing to carry. To be a foster in these hills meant something. It meant you were part of a sprawling, tangled web of blood relations. You were never truly alone, but you were never truly free either. Your triumphs and your shames belonged to the whole family. An insult to one foster was an insult to all, and the family's honor had to be protected at any cost. This wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. A family with a stained reputation was a weak family, vulnerable to its enemies. The weight of that name, and the secrets it had to protect, was a burden every foster, including Anne and Laura, carried from the day they were born. In a place like Wilkes County, news traveled faster on foot than it did by post. The general store, the churchyard, the grist mill, these were the arenas where reputations were built and destroyed. And at the center of this web of whispers was Anne Melton. Her affair with Tom Dooley wasn't just a private sin. It was a public spectacle, a long-running drama the entire community followed with a mix of condemnation and fascination. Every glance between them, every time he lingered too long at her farm, was noted, dissected, and woven into the local law. The supporting cast was a complex gallery of cousins and neighbors, each with their own loyalties and resentments. There was Pauline Foster, another cousin, a woman who moved through the community with watchful eyes. The exact nature of her relationship with Anne is lost to history, but the court records would later suggest a deep-seated animosity, the kind that festers between women who are too much alike or who have vied for the same things. Then there were the Meltons, James's family, who had to endure the shame of his wife's open infidelity. And there was James himself, a quiet, brooding figure. The community saw him as a cuckold, a weak man who couldn't control his wife. But was his silence weakness, or was it the coiled patience of a man nursing a deep and bitter wound? The affair itself was the great, unhealed sore on the community's skin. It was an affront to the sacred institution of marriage and a constant source of tension. But there were other, smaller slights that kept the air poisoned. A harsh word exchanged at a quilting bee, a dispute over a stray hog, the natural jealousies that arise when one family does slightly better than another. In these isolated hollows, such grievances weren't easily forgotten. They were collected like debts, passed down through whispers, waiting for a moment to be called due. The Foster clan was so large and interwoven that it was a world unto itself, rife with its own internal rivalries and power struggles. It was this fertile ground of gossip and resentment that allowed the most dangerous rumor of all to take root. When whispers of the foul disease began to circulate, they fell on ready ears. Syphilis was more than an illness. It was a mark of moral decay, a physical manifestation of sin. The rumor transformed the affair from a simple matter of adultery into something dark and terrifying. It was a secret that, if exposed, would bring a level of shame and ruin that was absolute. It wouldn't just be whispers,
it would be utter damnation. The air in Elkville grew thick and heavy. Anne, Tom, and Laura were no longer just three people caught in a tangle of passion. They were characters in a tragedy that everyone was watching unfold, a tragedy being written in real time by the relentless, unforgiving murmur of the community. The pressure was immense. Every smile felt like a mask, every conversation like an interrogation. The stage was set, and the ground was soaked with the fuel of old grudges, just waiting for a single spark to set the whole world ablaze. In the mountains, people have always paid attention to signs. They knew how to read the sky for a coming storm, and they knew how to read the woods for omens. And in the spring of 1866, the old folks would later claim the signs were all bad. They said the whippoorwills called too close to the houses, a sure sign of a soul about to depart. A strange, unnatural quiet seemed to settle in the hollows, a silence that felt sharp and heavy in the air, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for a coming violence. These were the whispers of the woods, the ancient language of dread that every mountain person understood in their bones. The true omen, however, was not a bird or a dream. It was a human one. It was the change that came over Laura Foster. The young, hopeful girl disappeared, replaced by a woman who had been handed a death sentence. When Laura learned she was sick and understood the shameful truth of how she'd gotten that way, the desperation must have been absolute. She was no longer just a spurned lover. She was a victim facing a slow, ugly decay. And she was not going to suffer that fate alone and in silence. Her threat to expose Tom, and by extension the married Anne Melton, was not the blackmail of a schemer. It was the last, defiant cry of a girl whose life had been ruined. That cry was a prophecy, and it spelled doom for Anne. Anne Melton would have felt it most of all. She was too sharp, too aware, not to see the abyss opening up before her. The whispers of the community were no longer just background noise. They were the sound of a trap being sprung. The easy power she held over men, the carefully constructed life she had built with her husband James, the fragile respectability she clung to, it was all about to be consumed by scandal and disease. She must have felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach that never went away, a premonition that the poison that had entered their lives had finally reached the heart. The walls of her world were groaning, and she knew that soon they would either come crashing down on top of her, or she would have to tear down someone else's first. The dam of whispers and threats was about to break. On a bright May morning, Laura Foster made her move. She walked out of her family's home, went to the barn, and saddled her father's mare. She told her family she was leaving to elope with Tom Dooley. This was it. This was the final desperate gamble of a girl who had nothing left to lose. It was not just a flight of romantic fancy, it was a public declaration, an act of defiance that would force every secret out into the sunlight. By riding away to meet Tom, she was setting the entire fragile world on fire. For Tom Dooley, this was the moment of reckoning. He was caught between two worlds, between the fiery, possessive love of Anne and the desperate, righteous claim of Laura. He had made promises to both. Now, Laura was calling in his debt. He had to meet her. He had to face the consequences of his actions. We'll never know what was in his heart on that day, true love for Laura, a sense of duty, or the fear of a man being led into a trap. But we know he went to the rendezvous. His fatal indecision, his inability to untangle the web he had woven, placed him squarely on the path to that shallow grave. The news of Laura's departure must have struck Anne Melton like a physical blow. The threat was no longer a possibility whispered in the dark. It was a girl on a horse, riding to destroy her. Laura's elopement with Tom would be the final, unforgivable humiliation. The whole sordid story, the affair, the lies, and the shameful disease would be laid bare for the entire county to see. The life Anne had so fiercely protected was about to be torn to shreds. The time for talk was over.
The time for manipulation and quiet threats had passed. A choice had to be made right there on that spring morning. And so, the first drops of blood were shed, not with a blade, but with a decision. The plan, whether hatched in a moment of panicked rage or cold calculation, was set in motion. The rendezvous between Tom and Laura was no longer a meeting of lovers. It was an ambush. The conflict escalated from a bitter personal feud into a conspiracy to commit murder. Someone, Anne or Tom, under her influence, decided that the only way to silence Laura Foster forever was to put her in the ground. As Laura rode away, the sun warm on her back, she must have felt a mix of terror and hope. She was leaving everything she had ever known behind, riding toward an uncertain future with the man she loved. She didn't know that she was not riding toward a new life. She was riding into a silence that had been carefully prepared for her, a silence as deep and final as the Appalachian earth itself. The point of no return had been crossed. The spot where Laura Foster drew rein on her father's mare was quiet and secluded. Sunlight filtered through the new spring leaves, dappling the forest floor. This was the place where her future was supposed to begin. She looked for Tom, her heart a frantic mix of hope and fear. But the figure, or figures, that emerged from the shadows of the rhododendron thicket did not offer the embrace she was expecting. We will never know the exact words that were spoken in those final moments. Was it a plea, an accusation, a bitter, venomous argument? Whatever was said, the hope in Laura's eyes must have died in an instant, replaced by the cold, stark terror of betrayal. There was no long, drawn-out scream to echo through the hollow. The violence was too sudden, too brutally intimate for that. There was likely just a sharp, choked gasp, the sound of a frantic, brief struggle in the dry leaves on the forest floor, and then a heavy, sickening thud. A sound of such finality that it seemed to drain all the life from the air around it. The sound of a life being abruptly, horribly extinguished. The world did not stop. It simply went on without her in it. The mare, panicked by the scent of terror and the sudden chaos, reared back, its eyes wide with fright. It tore through the underbrush, reins flying, the empty saddle a stark and terrible testament to what had just occurred. The horse ran without stopping, a mindless flight back toward the familiar scent of home, leaving behind a scene of unnatural stillness. A small piece of a woman's life, a bonnet perhaps, or a ribbon, lay trampled in the dirt, the only splash of color in a world that had suddenly gone gray. Then, the grim work began. The silence was broken not by cries or laments, but by the rhythmic, labored sound of digging. It was the scrape and clank of a tool, a shovel or a mattock, striking the hard, unforgiving Appalachian earth. It was a desperate, sweating labor, a race against the setting sun and the possibility of a chance wanderer. Each shovelful of dirt was not just soil being moved, it was an act of concealment, an attempt to erase a person, to bury a terrible secret so deep that it might never be found. The grave was shallow, dug with the frantic haste of those who wanted to be gone from that cursed place. There was no reverence, no ceremony. The burden of Laura's body, now just a thing to be hidden, was placed into the shallow trench. The sounds were muted and awful. The rustle of her homespun dress against the dirt, the dull weight of her form settling into the earth. It was a final, profound act of desecration. Then came the final sounds, the soft, heavy thuds of dirt being shoveled back into the hole, covering the last evidence of the crime. The person, or people, who stood there in the fading light, their clothes stained with soil and their lungs burning from the effort, were not just burying a body. They were burying a promise, a future, and a piece of their own souls. When they were finished, they tried to make it look as though nothing had happened. They scattered leaves over the freshly turned earth and arranged the branches just so. But the ground was wounded. No human eyes had witnessed the act, but the ancient trees stood as silent sentinels. The mountains had seen it all, and in the Blue Ridge, the mountains never, ever forget. To understand what happened in that secluded glade, you have to try, for a moment, to look at the world through Anne Melton's eyes. In her mind, Laura Foster was no longer a person. She wasn't her cousin. She wasn't a romantic rival. She was a disease, a walking plague that threatened to consume everything Anne had built. The syphilis rumor was a death sentence, not just for the body, but for the soul. It meant being cast out, shunned, left to rot in shame while the community whispered about your sins. Laura's threat to expose it all wasn't just blackmail, it was a promise of total annihilation. From Anne's perspective, this was not a matter of jealousy over Tom Dooley. This was a matter of survival, as primal and as ruthless as a cornered animal protecting its den. The twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. You cut out the infection before it kills you. The switch flipped the moment word reached her that Laura was on that mare, riding to meet Tom. Before that, the threat was a possibility, a problem that could perhaps be managed with manipulation or intimidation. But Laura on that horse was a lit fuse burning down to the powder keg. It was an act of open war. In that instant, all other options vanished. The cool, calculating part of Anne's mind, the part that had allowed her to manage an affair under her husband's nose and maintain her standing in the community, would have taken over completely. It was no longer a messy human drama. It was a cold, hard equation. Her life, her home, her name, or Laura's. There was no room for both. So when she confronted Laura in the woods, if indeed she was the one who did, it was likely not with the explosive rage of a jealous lover. It would have been with the chilling focus of an executioner. Each step, each word, each action would have been deliberate. She would have looked at Laura and seen not the face of a frightened girl, but the embodiment of her own destruction. The act itself would have been a task to be completed, a problem to be solved. This profound, terrifying detachment is the only thing that can explain the icy composure she displayed later. It wasn't the absence of feeling, it was the absolute suppression of it in the service of a single, overriding goal, self-preservation at any cost. And in the immediate aftermath, standing there in the silence of the woods, what would she have felt? Not guilt, not remorse. That would come later, perhaps, in the dark of night when the ghosts of memory came calling. No, in that moment, she would have felt a profound and chilling relief. The threat was gone. The voice was silenced. The secret was safe, buried under 6 feet of Appalachian dirt. She had faced absolute ruin and had stared it down. She had won. It was a victory that would poison her life and damn her name for all time. But as she walked away from that shallow grave, it was a victory nonetheless. The first sign that the world had broken was the sight of a horse. Wilson Foster's mare came trotting back to the farm late that afternoon, alone. Its coat was slick with sweat and streaked with mud. Its eyes were wild with a terror it couldn't speak. The empty saddle was a screaming accusation. A father's heart knows a specific kind of cold dread, and as Wilson Foster caught the reins of the panicked animal, that coldness flooded his veins. The story of an elopement suddenly felt like a lie, a thin blanket thrown over a horrible truth. In the days that followed, Wilson and his family scoured the woods. Their calls of Laura echoed through the hollows, answered only by the cawing of crows. The search was a frantic, desperate ritual. The woods that had been Laura's playground now felt like a tomb, each shadow seeming to hold a terrible secret. The community watched, and for a time they held on to the simpler explanation. They whispered that she had run off, that she and Tom were likely halfway to Tennessee by now. It was easier to believe in a reckless girl than a dead one. This casual dismissal left the Foster family isolated in their growing nightmare. Meanwhile, the main players in the drama had scattered. Tom Dooley had vanished. One day he was a fixture in the community, the next he was gone, his absence a thunderous confession of guilt. But Anne Melton was right where she had always been. She went about her daily chores on the Melton farm, a picture of domestic calm. When questioned, her face was a mask of innocence and concern. She knew nothing. She had seen nothing. Her icy composure was a wall that no one could breach, and it was, in its own way, more terrifying than Tom's flight. Weeks turned into a long, agonizing summer. The search parties grew smaller as hope withered on the vine. Laura Foster was now officially a missing person, a ghost story whispered around the supper table. But her family, particularly her father, refused to let the silence win. They kept looking, kept asking questions, their grief hardening into a grim resolve to find the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. The whispers in the community began to change, the simple story of elopement giving way to darker suspicions of foul play. The discovery, when it finally came, was a grim and heartbreaking affair. A man named Colonel James Grayson, a local justice of the peace and a friend of the Fosters, was led to a spot deep in the woods. There, under a thin covering of leaves and branches, he saw what he had been dreading for months, a patch of earth that was too soft, too new. He began to dig. It didn't take long to uncover the horror. The search was over. Laura Foster had been found. The news ripped through Wilkes County like a flash flood. The whispers became a roar of outrage. With the discovery of the body, a missing persons case became a murder investigation. The law, which had been passive for months, was now spurred into action. The full weight of suspicion fell squarely on the man who had run. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Thomas C. Dooley. A reward was posted for his capture. Tom Dooley was no longer just a reckless local boy. He was a wanted murderer, and the hunt was on. The discovery of Laura's body was like a rock thrown into a still pond, and the ripples of suspicion and fear spread to every last cabin in the county. The comfortable lie of elopement was shattered, and in its place, a terrible truth took root. A murder had been committed. One of their own had been put in the ground like an animal, and now everyone had to choose a side. The general store was no longer a place for idle gossip. It was a courtroom where theories were argued in hushed, angry tones. At church, families who had worshipped together for generations now sat on opposite sides of the aisle, their prayers heavy with judgment for their neighbors. A thick, suffocating fear settled over the community. This wasn't a crime committed by some nameless drifter. The killer, everyone knew, was still among them. Many people must have known pieces of the truth. They'd seen Tom and Ann arguing. They'd heard the rumors about the disease. Perhaps someone had even seen Ann returning home that fateful night, her dress soiled with mud and secrets. But the Foster clan was a sprawling, powerful entity, and Ann Melton, with her iron will and piercing gaze, was a terrifying woman to cross. To speak against her was to risk more than just a cold shoulder. It was to invite a feud, to put your own family and livelihood in jeopardy. And so, a conspiracy of silence was born, not of loyalty to a killer, but out of raw, primal fear. Still, the community was not a monolith. While many pointed the finger at the fugitive Tom Dooley, others whispered that he was just a fool, a pawn in a game played by a much more cunning mind. They looked at Ann Melton, saw her cold defiance, and came to their own conclusions. They saw a woman capable of anything, a woman who had bewitched both her husband and her lover, a woman who would stop at nothing to protect her name. Tom, they argued, might have helped dig the grave, but it was Ann's venom that had struck the fatal blow. In this poisoned atmosphere, small acts of courage and cowardice became monumental. There was the quiet neighbor who, risking the wrath of the Meltons, brought a basket of food to Laura's grieving family, a silent gesture of solidarity. There was the witness, Pauline Foster, who, whether out of a sense of justice or personal spite, decided to break the silence and tell the authorities what she claimed Ann had confessed. And on the other side, there were those who provided false alibis, who swore they'd seen Tom miles away when the murder occurred, weaving a web of lies to protect a friend or simply to avoid getting involved. The murder of Laura Foster had done more than kill a young woman. It had ripped the soul out of the community. Neighbor now looked at neighbor with suspicion.
Old friendships curdled into resentment. The valley was no longer a place of shared hardship and trust. It was a fractured landscape of fear, secrets, and unspoken accusations. The lines had been drawn in the dirt, and the blood that had been spilled would stain them forever. The manhunt for Tom Dooley was not just a matter of law, it was a matter of pride. Sheriff William Dooler, a relative of Tom's, was tasked with bringing him in, a duty that must have weighed on him like a shroud. But the official posse was swelled by harder men, men from the Foster clan whose faces were grim masks of determination. They weren't interested in a trial, they were interested in mountain justice, a swift and final accounting for the blood of their kin. They knew Tom, they knew his habits, and they knew the woods as well as he did. They weren't just chasing a killer, they were hunting a ghost who knew every shadow in their own backyard. For weeks, Tom was a phantom. He was a creature of these mountains, born and raised in their embrace, and now he used them as his shield. He moved by night, sleeping in caves and abandoned cabins, living off whatever he could forage or steal. The posse would find his tracks by a creek bed, only to have them vanish on the hard rock upstream. They'd get a tip that he was hiding in a certain hollow, and by the time they'd surrounded it, he was already miles away, watching their lanterns flicker from a distant ridge. The rhododendron thickets, so dense they were called laurel hells, were his fortress. He was making fools of them, and with every passing day, the legend of his cunning grew, while the frustration of the hunters curdled into a cold, patient rage. But Tom knew Wilkes County was a cage, and the walls were closing in. He couldn't run forever in a place where every face knew his name. His only hope was to disappear completely, to cross the Blue Ridge into Tennessee and start a new life under a new name. And so began the second, more desperate phase of the chase. He pushed westward into the wild heart of the mountains that separated the two states. This was a brutal, unforgiving wilderness, a vertical world of razorback ridges and sunless valleys. The hunt became an ordeal of endurance, a battle against not just a man, but against the mountains themselves. The posse, relentless and driven, stayed on his trail. They followed broken twigs, faint footprints in the mud, and the whispers of isolated mountain folk who had seen a haunted-looking stranger passing through. The chase stretched on, a slow, grueling pursuit through some of the most difficult terrain in the eastern United States. Tom was starving, exhausted, and the ever-present fear of the men behind him was a constant, gnawing companion. The freedom he had run for now felt like a different kind of prison, a cold and lonely one. He finally made it to Trade, Tennessee, a small settlement just across the state line. He was no longer Tom Dooley, the fiddle-playing charmer. He was just another ragged farmhand, calling himself Tom Hall, looking for work to fill his empty belly. He found it on the farm of a man named Colonel James C. Grayson. For a brief moment, he might have thought he had made it. He was anonymous. He was safe. But the posse had its own network, and word of a suspicious newcomer who fit Tom's description had trickled back across the mountains. The moment of capture was not a blaze of gunfire on a rocky cliffside. It was quiet, pathetic, and inevitable. The posse found him helping with the chores, his shoulders slumped with weariness. He looked up and saw the familiar hard faces from home, and in that instant, he knew the running was done. The fight had gone out of him. There was no struggle, no last defiant stand. There was only the quiet resignation of a man who had been hunted to the point of collapse. He surrendered without a word, exhausted and cornered, the great chase ending not with a bang, but with the click of iron shackles. The journey back to Wilkes County was a somber procession, the hunters bringing their quarry home to face the justice of men. The trial of Tom Dooley was the greatest spectacle Wilkes County had ever seen. The small town of Statesville, where the trial was moved to avoid the inflamed passions of the locals, swelled with spectators.
Farmers in dusty overalls stood shoulder to shoulder with men in fine suits, all of them craning their necks for a glimpse of the infamous killer and the woman at the center of the storm. The courtroom was a tinderbox. Armed deputies stood guard at the doors, their eyes scanning the crowd, wary of the foster-kin who were there to see justice done one way or another. Tom Dooley, gaunt and broken from his time on the run, looked like a condemned man from the moment he walked in. His defense was led by Zebulon Vance, a former governor of North Carolina and one of the most brilliant lawyers in the state. Vance argued passionately that the evidence against his client was purely circumstantial, a flimsy case built on rumor and the hysteria of a community desperate for a scapegoat. But the star witness, the one everyone had come to see, was Ann Melton. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was a vision of composure, her dark eyes sweeping over the crowd without a flicker of fear. She answered the prosecutor's questions with a cool, unshakable calm, denying everything. Her voice never wavered. She painted herself as a victim of malicious gossip, a respectable married woman whose name had been unfairly dragged through the mud. It was a masterful performance. To her supporters, she was a woman of incredible strength, unjustly accused. To her detractors, her icy demeanor was the ultimate proof of a sociopathic heart. A woman capable of orchestrating a murder and then lying about it without blinking. The trial was a parade of neighbors and cousins, their testimonies a tangled mess of personal grudges and second-hand stories. Pauline Foster delivered her damning testimony, claiming Anne had confessed the murder to her. But under the sharp cross-examination of Governor Vance, her credibility crumbled. She was portrayed as a spiteful woman, driven by jealousy and a personal vendetta against Anne. The case against Anne was built on a foundation of sand, one person's word against another's, with no hard evidence to tie her to the crime. In the end, the law of men, with its strict rules of evidence, could not convict her. The jury, faced with a mountain of innuendo but not a single piece of concrete proof, acquitted Ann Melton. A gasp went through the courtroom. She had walked into the heart of the fire and emerged without so much as the smell of smoke on her. She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked out of the courtroom a free woman, past the stunned and hateful glares of the Foster family. For Tom Dooley, there was no such escape. The evidence of his flight, his affair with Laura, and his presence near the scene was enough. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Justice had been delivered, but to many in that courtroom and in the hollows back home, it felt like a grotesque mockery. They had hanged the fool, but the mastermind, the true author of the crime, had just walked out the front door, free to return to her life as if nothing had ever happened. Was this the law of men? Or was it proof that some people were so cunning they could outwit justice itself? The thud of the trapdoor beneath Tom Dooley's feet was the final brutal punctuation mark on his life. With his death, the law was satisfied. But his last words from the gallows did not fade into the air. They hung over the hollows, a permanent stain on Ann Melton's name, a curse delivered with a dying man's breath. The trial was over, but the verdict of the mountains had just begun. For the Foster family, life became a long, quiet exercise in grief. They had a grave to tend now, a permanent scar on their land and on their hearts. But there was no closure. Every trip to the general store, every Sunday at church, held the possibility of seeing her, Ann Melton, the woman they believed had orchestrated their daughter's murder, living freely, her life continuing while Laura's had been cut short. They became the silent keepers of Laura's memory, their sorrow a cold, hard stone in the belly of the community, a constant, unspoken rebuke to the verdict of the court. And what of Anne? She had won her freedom, but she had lost everything else. The acquittal was not a pardon. It was a life sentence of a different kind. She returned to her farm with James Melton, but she was now a pariah, a ghost in her own life. Old friends would avert their eyes when she passed. Children would fall silent and hide behind their mother's skirts. She was utterly isolated, trapped in a prison of whispers and sideways glances. The community that had once been her stage was now her jury, and its judgment was a slow, daily poison. She was the woman who had gotten away with it, and for that, she would never be forgiven. History simply records that Anne Melton died a few years after the trial, likely from a fever or some other common malady of the time. But the legend, my friends, tells a different story. The legend is where the mountains delivered the justice the court could not. They say that Anne was consumed by the very disease that had started it all. That the syphilis drove her mad, her mind rotting away along with her body. The folklore insists her death was a thing of horror, that for days she was tormented by visions, screaming Laura Foster's name in the dead of night and clawing at phantom hands that were dragging her to hell. The legend gave her an end befitting the monster they believed her to be, agonizing, shameful, and utterly terrifying. It was a curse fulfilled. And so, the community tried to heal by forgetting. After the raw spectacle of the trial and Anne's supposed damnation, a thick blanket of collective silence fell over the story. It was too painful, too divisive. People stopped speaking the names of the dead. The murder of Laura Foster became a dark secret, a story you didn't tell your children, a wound that was left to scar over in private. They buried the truth under the weight of hard work and the passing of seasons, hoping that if they just stopped talking about it, the ghosts of 1866 would finally find their rest. The silence that the community so desperately tried to impose on this story was ultimately broken, not by a historian, but by a musician. In 1958, a clean-cut group of folk singers called the Kingston Trio recorded a simple, haunting ballad called Tom Dooley. The song became a worldwide phenomenon, a #1 hit. It flattened the brutal, complex tragedy into a simple tale of a love triangle gone wrong. The song became a ghost, its mournful tune drifting out of jukeboxes and radios across the country, ensuring that the names Tom Dooley and Laura Foster would never truly be forgotten. It was this song that pulled the story from the dusty archives and gave it a strange new life in the modern world. And the physical traces, my friends, they are still there. You can travel to Wilkes County today and find them. There's a small, fenced-in plot where a gravestone marks the final resting place of Tom Dooley. It's a newer stone, placed there long after the original was chipped away by souvenir hunters. You can also find the quiet, lonely grave of Laura Foster, tucked away in a family cemetery. But the grave of Anne Melton is harder to find. Some say she was buried next to her husband in the Melton family plot, while others whisper that she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, shunned by a family that could no longer bear the weight of her name. Even in death, she remains a figure of mystery and shadow. The land itself holds the memory. The old hanging tree in Statesville is long gone, but locals can still point to the spot where the gallows stood. And if you know who to ask, they can take you deep into the woods to a quiet, unremarkable patch of ground. There are no markers, no signs. But as you stand there in the silence of the forest, you can't help but feel a chill. This is the place. This is the earth that held Laura Foster's body for a long, hot summer. It is a wound in the landscape that has never fully healed. The descendants of the Fosters, the Meltons, and the Doulas still live in those hills. For generations, the story was a source of deep shame, a dark chapter that was never spoken of aloud. But the fame of the song changed that. It forced the story out into the light, transforming it from a private family tragedy into a piece of public American folklore. Today, the names no longer carry the same immediate sting, but they do carry an echo of a passion that burned too brightly, of a secret that was worth killing for, and of a tragedy that proves that while people may try to forget, the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning. a question that has echoed through these mountains for over 150 years. Was Anne Melton the true monster in this story? The lore gave us its answer. It said no. But the legend, the folklore, and the dying words of the man she loved screamed a different answer from the gallows. The truth, I believe, is buried somewhere in the murky soil between the two. The historical record is silent, but human nature is not. Anne Melton was a fiercely intelligent, passionate woman, trapped in a world that gave her very little power. When faced with total ruin, did she turn to an act of ultimate brutality to save herself? I cannot tell you with certainty that she held the blade. But I believe her will, her fear, and her desperation were the forces that drove the tragedy to its bloody conclusion. This is not just a simple story of a love triangle, the way the song tells it. This is a story about the awesome and terrifying power of secrets. It's a testament to how, in the isolated, close-knit world of the mountains, things like honor, shame, and reputation are not abstract ideas. They are matters of life and death. It's a brutal lesson in how love can curdle into obsession, and how obsession, when cornered, can become homicidal. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the indomitable Appalachian spirit, a spirit that will endure unimaginable hardship, protect its own with a fierce and sometimes violent loyalty, and never, ever forget a wrong. The Kingston Trio made Tom Dooley famous, but they only told you a piece of the tale. They never told you about the disease, the web of family secrets, or the cold, defiant woman who walked free, only to be imprisoned forever by her own legend. The ghosts of that tragedy still wander the hollows of Wilkes County, a timeless reminder of a passion that burned a hole in the fabric of the mountains. They are a warning that the darkest hearts sometimes beat within the most beautiful chests, and that justice, in the end, is not always found in a courtroom. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. For 3 days, the law in Blackwater County was gone. A posse of the county's toughest men stood helpless at the mouth of the black hole, a jagged maw in the mountainside that seemed to breathe a cold older than memory. They were waiting for one man, Sheriff Banquo Fletcher, who had walked into that absolute darkness 3 days prior, hunting a killer the rest of them were too terrified to pursue. Now, silence was their only answer. Did the legendary Lawmen finally meet his match? Not in a man, but in the earth itself. Today, we go back to that moment of terrifying uncertainty to uncover the truth of the man who walked into a legend and came back forever changed. The 2 men who died weren't just company guards, they were Blackwater County men. The first was Thomas Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of his 50 years in the mines. His hands were thick with calluses, but they were gentle with his grandchildren. He'd taken the guard job to get out of the deep shafts, hoping for a few quiet years before he retired. The second was David Eames, barely 20 years old, with a quick smile and eyes full of plans to marry his sweetheart and buy a small plot of land downriver. They weren't heroes or gunslingers. They were just ordinary men, trying to earn a living in a world that offered few easy paths. Their world was one of stark contrasts. The green, ancient mountains held communities bound by blood and tradition, where folks lived by the seasons and the grace of God. But cutting through this old world were the black veins of the new one, the coal mines. Company towns sprung up overnight, filled with the soot of the tipple and the clang of steel on rock. Life was hard, pay was low, and the company store kept everyone in a state of perpetual debt. This friction between the old ways and the new money created a constant, simmering tension. The payroll wagon was a symbol of it all, a tempting prize moving through a land of desperate men. Standing watch over this fragile peace was Sheriff Banquo Fletcher. Before he became a legend, he was simply the law. He was a constant, predictable presence, as much a part of the landscape as the hawk circling the ridge. You'd see him at the general store, not saying much, but listening to everything. He knew whose cow had gone missing, whose son was running with the wrong crowd, and which feuds were simmering just below the surface.
He was the community's anchor, a man who believed in a simple, unshakable truth. There was right and there was wrong, and it was his job to stand on that line. But Fletcher was more than just a badge. He was born of these hills, and he understood their silent language. He felt the weight of every family's troubles, every whispered fear. This connection to his people was his strength, but it was also a heavy burden. He saw the desperation the coal companies bred, and he knew it would eventually boil over into violence. He was one man holding back a flood, and he knew it. His quiet, solitary life was a reflection of the immense responsibility he carried on his shoulders alone. The world that was, before Silas Kane pulled the trigger, was one of fragile order. It was a community holding its breath, praying that the simmering tensions wouldn't erupt into open flame. Thomas Miller and David Eames were part of that order, men doing their duty. Sheriff Fletcher was its ultimate guardian, but their peaceful world had a shadow, a dark place where the law didn't reach and fear held sway. The murder of those two guards wasn't just a crime, it was a challenge. It was Silas Kane declaring that the old rules were dead and that even the mountains couldn't protect you anymore. The scene of the attack was on a lonely stretch of road winding through a deep cut in the mountain, a place where the sun struggled to reach the forest floor even at midday. The payroll wagon sat askew, one wheel splintered in a ditch. The two horses stood unnaturally still in their harnesses, their heads bowed, their coats trembling despite the cool air. A profound and terrible silence had fallen over the hollow, broken only by the drip of water from moss-covered rocks. The payroll box was gone, its hasp broken and discarded in the mud. The bodies of Miller and Eames lay where they fell, covered by canvas blankets that couldn't hide the dark stains seeping into the earth. When Sheriff Fletcher arrived, he didn't join the quiet, grim-faced huddle of men who had discovered the wagon. He moved away from them, his grey eyes scanning not the wagon, but the woods surrounding it. He walked the perimeter of the clearing in a slow, deliberate circle, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was reading the forest floor like a page in a book, taking in every bent twig, every disturbed patch of last year's leaves. He was a man searching for a story, and he knew these woods would tell him the truth if he just knew how to listen. The clues he found were chilling, not for what they revealed, but for what they didn't. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic footprints of men running for their lives. There was only one set of tracks leading from the tree line and one set leading back. They were from a single man, a heavy man, moving with a calm, unhurried gait. And then Fletcher found the most unnerving clue of all. On a flat, mossy rock about 20 yards from the wagon, he found two spent rifle cartridges. They weren't scattered where they would have been ejected from the chamber. They were placed neatly side by side, like a pair of cufflinks set out for church. This was what unsettled everyone more than the violence itself. This wasn't the work of a panicked thief. The careful placement of the shells was a message. It was a statement of absolute control, of a chilling lack of fear. It spoke of a killer who had watched his victims fall and then taken the time to gather his brass and leave a signature. The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions. Who was this man? And what kind of cold-blooded pride did it take to commit murder and then pause to arrange the evidence like a trophy? The scene spoke not of chaos, but of a terrifying, predatory calm. Before the dust had even settled on the lonely mountain road, a name was already being whispered from the company town to the deepest hollows. It was the name of a man with a grudge as raw and public as an open wound. Jedediah Schofield. Schofield was a miner, or at least he had been. He was a man known for a temper as hot as a forge and a pride as sharp and brittle as shale. And everyone in Blackwater County knew he hated Thomas Miller with a passion that burned cold. The bad blood had started 6 months earlier, deep in the belly of the earth. Schofield, a top man with the dynamite, had gotten into a bitter argument with another miner. an argument that turned into a brutal fistfight right there in the shaft. The shift foreman had been Thomas Miller. Following company rules, Miller reported the fight, and since Schofield had thrown the first punch, he was the one who was fired. He lost his job, his pay, and the small company house where his family lived. In a single day, he was cast out. To a man like Schofield, this was more than losing a job. It was a public shaming. He blamed Thomas Miller entirely, seeing him not as a man doing his duty, but as a traitor who had sided with the company against his own kind. In the weeks that followed, Schofield's bitterness festered. He was seen in the local saloons, his voice thick with moonshine and rage, vowing revenge. More than one person heard him swear that he would see Miller in his grave before he and his family starved. The whispers quickly turned into a roar of accusation. Jedediah Schofield owned a deer rifle, the same caliber as the shells Fletcher had found. He was a crack shot, known for his skill in the woods. Most damning of all, when the deputy went to the rundown shack Schofield's family had moved into, he was gone. His wife, her face pale with fear, claimed he'd gone hunting a few days back and hadn't returned, but the community saw it differently. To them, it was an open and shut case. A man with a clear motive, the right skills, and who had conveniently vanished at the exact time of the crime. Schofield had run, and in the mountains, only a guilty man runs. While the whole county had its eyes fixed on Jedediah Schofield, Sheriff Fletcher's gaze, grey and steady as a river stone, settled on someone else entirely. It was a person so close to the tragedy that no one thought to look at him. Caleb Thorne, the best friend of the young guard, David Eames. Caleb and David had been inseparable since they were boys, their bond forged in the creeks and woods of Blackwater County. They were two sides of the same coin, sharing every secret and every dream of a life beyond the coal dust. No one seemed more devastated by David's death than Caleb. No one, that is, except Sheriff Fletcher. He had seen grief in all its forms, and Caleb's felt wrong. It was too loud, too theatrical. At the funeral, Caleb wept with a noise that drowned out the quiet sorrow of the boy's own mother. But Fletcher, standing at the back of the cemetery, noted that for all the performance, the man's eyes were sharp and restless. He wasn't looking at the grave, he was watching the crowd. Fletcher knew that true grief turns a man inward, but Caleb Thorne was looking outward, like a man checking to see if his story was being believed. Beneath that mask of sorrow was a secret that was rotting Caleb from the inside out. He wasn't just a simple mine worker, he was a gambler who had fallen in deep with a dangerous crowd from the railroad camps. He owed a debt so large it was a death sentence, and the men he owed were not known for their patience. The company payroll wasn't just a target of opportunity for him, it was his only way out. His best friend, David Eames, hadn't just been a friend. He was Caleb's unwitting key to the prize, a source of information about the wagon's route and its schedule. The whispers started when Caleb was seen just days after the funeral, paying off a chunk of his debt at a saloon with crisp bills. When questioned, he claimed he'd won a lucky hand at cards. But the story felt thin, and his behavior, when re-examined, painted a darker picture. People now remembered Caleb asking David pointed questions about the guard rotation, questions that seemed innocent at the time, but now felt sinister. The idea was almost too ugly to consider, that the attack wasn't a random ambush, but a meticulously planned execution, and that David Eames might have been betrayed by the one person on earth he trusted completely. But there was a third shadow in these hills, one cast not by a single man, but by the towering black tipple of the mine itself. The Black Mountain Coal Company was more than an employer. It was a hungry, faceless power from the north, and its interests rarely aligned with the well-being of the men it paid in scrip. In the months leading up to the robbery, a new kind of man had been seen in the county. Men in dark suits and city hats, with faces as hard and emotionless as the company ledger books. They weren't miners or managers. They were troubleshooters, company enforcers, and their presence felt like the stillness before a storm. Their motive was impersonal, but immense. Whispers of unionizing had been snaking through the mine shafts, talk of better pay and safer conditions. To the company, the union wasn't a negotiation. It was a disease to be eradicated. A violent, unsolved payroll robbery was the perfect pretext. It would justify flooding the county with their own heavily armed guards, men who answered not to the law, but to the company. They could lock down the towns, root out the organizers, and break the spirit of the rebellion under the guise of protecting the people from a phantom killer. Miller and Eames, in this cold calculation, were simply the cost of doing business. The arrival of these city men had draped a blanket of unease over the community. They didn't speak to locals, they observed, their eyes taking measure of everything. They were seen mapping the roads, timing the payroll wagon's route, and holding quiet, tense meetings behind the locked door of the company office. Their presence was a silent, constant threat. It was a clear message from the powers up north that they were watching, and that they would not tolerate dissent. The mountain folk, who had dealt with their own problems for generations, now felt the chilling gaze of an outside world that saw their home as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and controlled. The crime itself bore the hallmarks of this cold, corporate ruthlessness. The clean, efficient nature of the ambush, the lack of any wasted motion, and especially the chilling signature of the carefully placed shell casings. It all felt less like the hot-blooded revenge of a fired miner and more like the work of a professional. It was a calculated act of terror designed to create chaos. Perhaps the stolen money was never the point. Perhaps the real prize was fear itself, a tool the company could wield to crush the growing defiance of the men who worked and died in its mines. With Jedediah Schofield named as the prime suspect, a posse of grim-faced men formed, fueled by righteous anger and cheap corn liquor. They were ready to deliver mountain justice with a rope. Sheriff Fletcher led them, but he moved with a different purpose. While the others saw a clear trail of vengeance, Fletcher saw a path that was too obvious, too neat. He wasn't hunting a man he hated, he was solving a puzzle, and he knew the first piece you find isn't always the one that fits. For 4 days, they beat the brush, scouring the unforgiving ridges and impenetrable rhododendron thickets that Schofield called home. The mountains, however, are experts at hiding men, and the trail was cold. It wasn't Fletcher who found him, but a young deputy who stumbled upon an old trapper's lean-to deep in a forgotten hollow. Inside, they found Jedediah Schofield, not defiant, but gaunt and shivering, his rifle unused beside him. He hadn't been running from the law, he had been hiding from it. He knew he was the first man they'd blame, and his terror was so genuine it was almost palpable. His alibi, when it came, was as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. He had been miles away from the ambush, helping the circuit preacher, old Reverend Eli, repair the roof on the remote Black Creek Chapel. He'd been there for a solid week, sleeping in the church and sharing the preacher's meager meals. The Reverend, a man whose word was considered scripture in those parts, confirmed it without a moment's hesitation. Jedediah Schofield was a man full of rage and bitterness, but he was no killer. The most promising lead had evaporated into thin mountain air. Attention then shifted to Caleb Thorne, but that trail was made of smoke and mirrors. There was no physical evidence, only the foul taste of suspicion. He had an answer for everything. The money? A lucky night playing cards with strangers at a railroad camp, men who were long gone. His odd questions to David. Just the normal curiosity of a friend. The community, unwilling to stomach the thought of such a venomous betrayal, chose to believe him. To accuse him without proof was to call one of their own a monster, a truth too ugly to face. The investigation had hit a wall of solid granite, leaving Sheriff Fletcher with nothing but a pair of spent shells and a county where the fear was beginning to grow teeth. With the official investigation stalled, a cold fog of silence settled over Blackwater County. The lively chatter at the general store died down whenever Sheriff Fletcher walked in. Doors that were once open were now latched, and eyes that met yours on the road would slide away, refusing to connect.
It was as if the whole community had collectively agreed to forget the murders had ever happened. Neighbors who had once shared every piece of gossip now saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. The truth, it seemed, was a dangerous secret to possess. This silence was woven from three distinct threads. The first was raw, simple fear. A killer was among them, a man who had shot down two people in cold blood and left a chilling signature of his arrogance. He was a ghost, a name without a face, and he could be anyone. To speak a word of what you might have seen, to even speculate out loud, was to risk drawing his attention. It was to risk waking up and finding your own grim message left on your doorstep. The wolf was still in the woods, and no one wanted to be the next sheep to stray from the flock. The second thread was a deep, abiding hatred for the Black Mountain Coal Company. To many of the mountain folk, the company was a far greater evil than any one killer. It was a faceless monster that stole their land, poisoned their streams, and worked their men to death for pennies. The stolen money belonged to the company, and the dead guards were on the company payroll. In their minds, helping Fletcher was helping the company. It was a choice between two evils, and many chose silence as a form of quiet rebellion against the power that oppressed them every single day. But the thickest, strongest thread was the mountain code itself, an unspoken omerta, as binding as any law on the books. You did not talk to the law about the affairs of your neighbors. You handled your own business, settled your own scores, and you never, ever turned on your own kind for an outsider. And to many, even Sheriff Fletcher, in his official capacity, was an outsider to family matters. This loyalty, this stubborn, ingrained belief in their own form of justice, formed a wall far higher and stronger than any prison. Fletcher found himself on the outside of his own community, a lawman trying to find a killer in a town that had gone deaf, dumb, and blind. 5 years turned to dust. The seasons in Blackwater County rolled on, covering the memory of the murders with layers of autumn leaves and winter snow. The case went cold, a ghost story whispered by old men, a permanent quiet failure that Sheriff Banquo Fletcher carried in the lines on his face. The 2 spent shells still sat on his desk in a small wooden box, a cold testament to a question he couldn't answer. The community's wall of silence had held, and the truth seemed lost to time. The clue that broke it all came not from a clever deduction or a piece of new evidence, but from the rambling memory of an old woman on the edge of the next world. Granny Elspeth lived in a one-room cabin perched like a hawk's nest on a ridge overlooking the very road where the ambush took place. Her mind, the folks in town said, was a tangled thicket of memories and mountain lore, and her words were often dismissed as the wind in the pines. Fletcher, however, made a point of checking on the old woman, bringing her salt and flour when the snows were deep. On one such visit, sitting by her hearth, he listened as she drifted through the past. She spoke of the hard winter of '08, of a blight that killed the chestnut trees, and then, without any change in her tone, she said something that made the air in the tiny cabin stand still. "Such a shame about that young Eames boy," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was always so polite. I saw him walking up the road that very morning with his friend, Caleb Thorne. They was laughing, heads together like they was sharing a secret. Not an hour later, I heard the guns. For Sheriff Fletcher, it was as if the last 5 years had collapsed into a single blinding instant. Caleb Thorne's alibi had been rock solid. He had been at the mine, working a full shift. Multiple men had sworn to it. But Granny Elspeth, whose cabin sat miles from the mine entrance, had seen him on the murder road with the victim just before he died. It wasn't a confession she offered, but a simple, unvarnished memory, one that nobody had ever thought to ask for. The old woman, dismissed by everyone, had been the only witness. In that moment, the entire case was reborn. Fletcher realized the horrifying truth. Caleb's alibi hadn't been solid. It had been constructed. He had paid or threatened his fellow miners to lie for him, a conspiracy of silence bought with stolen payroll money.
The laughter Granny Elspeth heard hadn't been the sound of friendship. It had been the sound of betrayal. The case wasn't just cold. It had been buried alive. And Sheriff Fletcher had just been handed the shovel. A 5-year-old lie is a brittle thing. With Granny Elspeth's testimony in his pocket, Sheriff Fletcher moved with the cold patience of a winter freeze. He didn't go for Caleb Thorne. Not yet. He went for the men who had built the walls of his alibi. He found them one by one, in the mines, in their homes, at the saloon. He didn't threaten or shout. He simply sat with them, his grey eyes unblinking, and told them what the old woman on the ridge had seen. He spoke of perjury, of being an accessory to murder, and then he would fall silent, letting the weight of what they had done crush them. The first miner held out for an hour, the second for 10 minutes. The third broke before Fletcher even finished his sentence. The confrontation, when it came, was on the porch of the small, respectable house Caleb Thorne had bought with his blood money. He had grown soft in 5 years, the desperate gambler replaced by a man who believed his own lies. He greeted the sheriff with a confident smile, but it faltered and died when he saw the look on Fletcher's face. The lawman wasn't there for a social call. "I spoke with Granny Elspeth," Fletcher began, his voice flat. "She remembers seeing you that morning, Caleb, on the road with David, just before the shots." Caleb scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "An old woman's fancies. I was at the mine. Ask anyone." And that was the moment Fletcher sprung the trap. "I did," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I asked Tom Jenkins, and I asked Sam Carter." Their memories seemed to have gotten a lot clearer in the last 24 hours. The color drained from Caleb's face. The mask of the respected citizen shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. Fletcher took a step closer, his shadow falling over the other man. "But here's the thing that's been bothering me, Caleb. The tracks at the scene, they were from a big man, a heavy man, and those shells placed so neat. That wasn't your style. You're a coward. You always were. You didn't have the nerve to pull the trigger." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and cold. "You just led your best friend into the woods to be slaughtered like a hog. You gave the route, the time, everything. And you did it for a man in a city suit, a company man, the one who came down to break the union talk, a big man named Corbin." Fletcher's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow breaking down the last of Caleb's defenses. "He pulled the trigger, and you collected your 30 pieces of silver. It was all there, the whole sickening truth. It wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery born of desperation. It was a cold-blooded business deal. The Black Mountain Coal Company needed an excuse to crush its workers, and Caleb Thorne, drowning in debt, was their willing instrument. He sold out his friend, his community, and his own soul. Caleb didn't confess with words. He simply collapsed, folding in on himself on the porch steps, a hollowed-out man whose guilt was now as plain to see as the mountains against the sky. The ghost finally had a face, and it was the face of a friend. Let us now step back into the shadows of that terrible morning. This is not a story from a court record, but a reconstruction pieced together from a confession, a dying woman's memory, and the cold logic of the crime scene itself. This is how it must have been. The morning air was cool and heavy, with the damp smell of moss and wet earth. David Eames walked up the road with a lightness in his step, laughing at a joke told by the man he trusted most in the world, Caleb Thorne. He was young, and his mind was on his future, not on the deep shadows pooling between the ancient trees. From those shadows, a shape detached itself. A big man in a city coat, his face impassive. This was Corbin, the company enforcer. There was no warning, no shouted demand. David likely didn't even have time to register the man as a threat before the hollow was shattered by a single flat crack that was not thunder. It was a sound that slapped the air and sent the birds scattering from the trees in a frantic, silent explosion. It was not a fight. It was an execution. For David,
There would have been a moment of searing confusion, a feeling of the world tilting on its axis, and perhaps, in his last second of sight, he would have seen his best friend's face contorted, not with surprise, but with a terrible, knowing guilt. Thomas Miller, a man who had survived 30 years of rockfalls and dynamite blasts, was a professional. His hand would have instinctively dropped to the pistol